The sun is setting over the ruins of a forgotten temple. The last light of day clings to the marble, soft and gold, as if reluctant to let go. Dust drifts through the air like ancient breath. The world grows quiet. Even the cicadas hush, as though the stones themselves are waiting for something to be remembered. Once, these walls echoed with prayers. Hands touched their surfaces. Lips whispered names now lost to every tongue. Centuries later, only wind remains to finish those forgotten sentences. The pillars stand like ribs of a giant long dead, and the earth holds its silence tenderly, as if protecting an old secret. Most travelers see only beauty here, classical perfection, frozen glory. Yet beneath the marble dust lies a quieter story, one that trembles beneath the surface of history. We are taught that Greek myth is complete, a finished tapestry of gods and heroes. But history has gaps, and within those gaps live the myths that did not survive. Stories buried not by time, but by intention. Imagine the scrolls that never made it through the fires of conquest. Imagine the songs forbidden because they spoke of gods who challenged the order of Olympus. Some myths were not forgotten accidentally. They were silenced. Perhaps they told truths that did not serve power. Perhaps they worshipped the wrong kind of divinity, gods of chaos, of equality, of tenderness too dangerous for empires. The air around the temple feels heavy, like the moment before rain. In that stillness, the mind begins to wander backward through the ages. Picture an old storyteller, his voice trembling beside a fire, warning his listeners to speak softly of the ones erased. He tells of a goddess who loved mortals too deeply, and a god who refused to bow to Zeus. These are not the stories written on papyrus or carved into stone. These lived in breath, in memory, in fear. For centuries, myth was not read, it was spoken. Passed from one mouth to another, it changed shape like smoke. What survived became scripture. What vanished became rumor. And when empires rose, they chose which tales to keep. The victors always decide what counts as truth. We stand among their ruins now, thinking we know their world. We name their gods, we build our museums, we quote their poets. But the marble dust tells a different story. It settles over everything equally, the noble and the nameless, the celebrated and the censored. If you listen long enough, you can almost hear it whisper. The past was never one voice. It was a chorus, and most of its singers were silenced. The line between history and myth is thinner than the dust on these stones. Every civilization decides what to remember, and memory, once chosen, becomes a kind of weapon. What we call enlightenment may have begun with an act of forgetting. Beneath every shining god stands another shadowed, unrecorded, waiting for a name. As twilight deepens, the ruins fade into shapes rather than structures. The imagination fills in what time erased. Flickers of firelight, the hum of hymns, the scent of oil lamps. The scene feels alive again, if only for a moment. In that moment, we are part of the story, not visitors, but witnesses to its quiet persistence. It is strange how silence can feel louder than sound. The temple has become its own storyteller. Each crack in the marble is a sentence, each fallen column a forgotten chapter. And somewhere beneath our feet, under layers of soil and centuries, lie the remnants of other shrines, other prayers. They wait, as all forgotten things do, for someone willing to listen. We have been taught that the gods of Greece are eternal, perfect, immortal, complete. But eternity is a fragile thing when it depends on human memory. The myths that survived did so because they served a purpose. The ones that vanished perhaps told us too much. Maybe they hinted that gods were not all-powerful beings in the sky, but reflections of ourselves, imperfect, yearning, afraid of being forgotten. The sun finally slips below the horizon. The marble cools. The dust settles once more, blanketing the earth like sleep. In this fading light, one thought lingers. What if the gods you know were only the ones allowed to survive? And as the wind moves through the ruins, it carries that question forward softly, endlessly toward the next flicker of fire, where another story waits to be told. Night has gathered fully now. The temple behind us fades into silhouette, swallowed by the slow rise of the stars. Somewhere in the distance, the sea sighs against the rocks, repeating the same rhythm it has known for thousands of years. The air smells of salt and ash. We follow that sound inland, to the flicker of a single flame hidden inside a cave mouth, where the first storytellers once wove the world from breath and fear. Long before Zeus thundered or Athena spoke wisdom, there were other voices. They belonged to people who had no temples yet, no marble columns, no written word. Their gods were shapes of the wind and the rustle of leaves, the glare of lightning and the cry of beasts at night. They did not worship perfection, they worshipped survival. Around their fires, they whispered names that would never reach the scrolls of later ages. Those names clung to stones, to rivers, to dreams. And though the scholars would later call them superstition, they were the beginning of everything we now call myth. Imagine the Minoans on Crete, carving spirals into clay, their stories circling endlessly like the sea that surrounded them. Imagine the Pelasgians, older still, watching the stars and believing each flicker was a heartbeat of the sky itself. Their gods had no faces yet. They were mists and memories, rising from the dark soil whenever humans feared the night. In those days, a myth was not a tale to pass time, it was a map for surviving uncertainty. To speak of a spirit was to acknowledge the mystery within nature, and perhaps within oneself. The fire in the cave crackles softly. A storyteller lifts a hand, his eyes reflecting the flame. His audience leans close, their shadows bending against the wall. He begins without grand words, only rhythm, the slow pulse of meaning carried in repetition. Each syllable builds a bridge between fear and wonder. The story may tell of a shapeless mother who gave birth to mountains, or of a silent god who slept beneath the sea. It does not matter which, for every listener hears what their heart needs most, the assurance that there is purpose hidden within chaos. Language was still young then, fragile as smoke. Words shifted with every generation, reshaping gods as easily as tides reshape the shore. A word for light might become a name for divinity. A word for hunger might evolve into a demon. Through sound, they built the architecture of belief. Some phrases were never spoken outside ritual, others were only sung. The power of sound was sacred because silence was always near, waiting to swallow it. In that tension between sound and silence, mythology was born. The people of these islands lived with earthquakes, storms, and sudden death. They saw the ground tremble, the sky burn, and they imagined spirits within every force. Over time, the nameless ones acquired faces, and faces became hierarchies. What began as whispers of gratitude to the earth turned into organized worship. And with organization came ownership of stories, of meaning, of truth. It is easy to forget how fragile memory was before writing. A single winter could erase generations of tales if a storyteller died without an apprentice. To preserve a story was an act of devotion, not ambition. Each word carried the weight of lineage. When the world felt unpredictable, these stories offered a structure, a promise that behind every storm was intention. But intention implies will, and will implies gods, and so the unseen forces of nature became beings who could listen. Before there were names for gods, there were shadows that listened. The cave hums with this idea. You can almost hear the echoes of 1,000 voices layered across time, every flame, every tongue, repeating variations of the same longing to be heard by the universe. The act of storytelling was itself a ritual of connection. Those who spoke the words believed they were feeding the memory of the world, keeping it alive through sound. Even the pauses between words mattered. Silence was treated as sacred breath, the moment the divine leaned close. When we look back, we often divide myth and fact as if they were enemies. But to these early minds, they were twins. A myth explained what facts could not, and facts confirmed what myths had already promised. In the firelight, truth was not measured, it was felt. The listeners did not question whether the goddess truly turned into a tree. They wondered what the tree meant for them, what part of themselves it represented. In this way, myth became the first mirror. As dawn civilizations merged, the old stories began to shift. The Cretans borrowed from the sea peoples, the mainland tribes absorbed the Minoan symbols, and each retelling pushed the older gods further into shadow. What once was worshipped as the mother became a consort, then a daughter, then a whisper. The shapeless father of winds became a subordinate under the new thunderer. These transformations did not happen overnight. They unfolded over centuries, quietly, through retellings around countless fires. Every generation adjusted the tale to match its world until the original voices were buried beneath layers of interpretation. Somewhere along this slow evolution, the idea of perfection entered myth. The gods became more human and yet more distant. They gained personalities, tempers, jealousies. They could be loved, feared, bargained with. This shift reflected a changing human world, a move from survival tribes to structured cities. The gods began to mirror the systems that ruled their believers. Where once nature had been worshipped, now power was. Myth became hierarchy. Still, the fire kept burning. Even when official temples rose, some families continued to tell the old stories in secret. They called upon nameless spirits during harvests, whispered to the river before crossing, left offerings at stones long after the priests declared them meaningless. The new gods had statues, the old ones had memory. And memory, though invisible, often lasts longer than stone. There is something haunting about this endurance. Though their language is lost, though their names crumble into dust, the emotion behind those first prayers still lingers. It lives in the way we stare into flames and find faces, or in the quiet sense that something unseen listens when we speak our fears aloud. Mythology, stripped of its marble and scripture, remains the same ancient act, giving shape to the invisible. If you close your eyes, you can almost feel that first warmth, the way the flame painted moving stories on the cave walls. Those shadows were the earliest theaters, the first screens of imagination. Perhaps this is why stories still calm us before sleep. They echo that primeval comfort of light against darkness. Every bedtime tale, every whispered legend, is an echo of that first night when humans turned fear into beauty. Outside the cave, dawn is approaching. The fire dwindles, and the storyteller's final words drift into smoke. The listeners rise, carrying the tale within them like embers. They will tell it again, somewhere else, and it will change again, as all living things must. The gods they describe will be slightly different. The meaning will evolve. Yet the essence will survive the need to find the divine in the unknown. When we return our gaze to the horizon, the world of marble and temple feels less eternal. Those grand myths of Olympus suddenly seem like the latest chapter of a much older story, one written not in stone but in breath. And just as the flame dies, a question glows in the ashes. What else might have burned away before history began to write? The embers fade, but the warmth remains. The night has told us its secret, and dawn waits patiently for us to listen again. Somewhere beyond the hills, another voice will soon begin a different version, carrying forward the same hunger to remember. And as that voice rises, we are drawn with it toward the next mystery, toward the shadow of a forgotten god who once dared to challenge Olympus itself. The trail begins not in legend, but in silence. Somewhere between the known gods of Olympus and the forgotten spirits of the earth lies a missing name, a presence once spoken by thousands, now vanished as if it never existed. The scholars who study these gaps in history often say that silence itself can be evidence. A missing record, a blank tablet, a name chiseled out of stone, each absence becomes a clue. In these empty spaces, the forgotten god waits, The first trace appears in a temple ruin on the island of Naxos. Among inscriptions to Apollo and Dionysus, a fragment of marble bears an unfinished word, Eli. The rest has been deliberately scraped away. The grooves suggest human hands, not erosion. Beneath the letters, a faint carving of an eye surrounded by waves, an unusual motif for either god. The archaeologists catalog it as an anomaly, a curiosity not worth pursuit. But others, studying older fragments found on the mainland, notice the same mark repeating. The eye, the water, the erased name. They begin to whisper of a deity erased from the Greek pantheon, a god of twilight and silence, known in pre-Hellenic times, perhaps before even the Minoans. His domains were said to lie between light and dark, between life and death, between the spoken and the unspoken. To his followers, he was not a god of action, but of memory and forgetting. Some fragments call him the listener, others, he who waits between. His altars were few, his rituals secret. In later centuries, the priests of Apollo would call such worship dangerous. Anything that blurred the lines between gods and mortals threatened the order of Olympus. The listener, it was said, did not demand sacrifice or obedience. He asked only for remembrance. To speak his name aloud was to awaken the echoes of the dead, and so the name was removed first from songs, then from prayers, and finally from stone. But erasure leaves scars. In the ruins of Thessaly, excavators discovered a series of votive offerings buried deep beneath a later temple. Small clay figures, each headless, arranged in circles facing inward. Beneath them, a thin layer of blackened soil as if something once burned there long ago. The accompanying inscription reads simply, "To the one beneath." Scholars argue over its meaning. Some claim it was a local earth spirit. Others suspect it belonged to a suppressed sect. Yet the symbol of the eye returns, carved on a fragment of bronze lying among the ash. The pattern deepens. Across scattered sites, pieces align. A coin found near Delphi bearing an erased face. A statue in a private collection showing a figure neither male nor female, its mouth sealed by a band of stone. Every clue points toward a divinity that defied categorization, a god who existed in the spaces between definitions. Perhaps that was his crime. The old poets hinted at such a being. Hesiod once wrote of a presence unseen that listens when none else do. Later commentaries dismissed it as metaphor, but the phrasing reappears in an obscure Orphic hymn, one that speaks of the shadow that remembers. When read alongside the archaeological evidence, the suggestion becomes chillingly plausible. A god once revered as the keeper of silence, deliberately erased by a culture that feared ambiguity. One theory proposes that this god represented a form of balance, the stillness between opposites, the quiet between thunder and prayer. In a world of powerful, loud, assertive deities, such neutrality would have seemed threatening. The Olympians thrived on hierarchy and spectacle, but the listener offered no miracles, no punishment. He merely existed, reflecting back what worshippers brought to him. To priests seeking control, that would be intolerable. A god who needed nothing could not be owned. The question then arises, how does one erase a god? The answer lies not in destruction, but in substitution. Over time, traits once belonging to this forgotten figure were absorbed into others. Hades inherited his connection to the unseen. Hermes took his link to the border between worlds. Even Apollo borrowed his silence, transforming it into the stillness of meditation. The original presence dissolved, scattered through the pantheon like dust in sunlight. Only fragments remained, unattached symbols, recurring motifs, whispers of meaning without a name. And yet, within these fragments, a strange coherence lingers. In certain coastal villages, old fishermen still leave offerings of water at dawn, murmuring to the horizon rather than to the sun. They say it brings calm seas, though no one remembers why. In some mountain hamlets, Travelers report seeing circular stone markers carved with the faint trace of an eye, always half erased, as though out of reverence or fear. These gestures may be nothing more than cultural residue, but perhaps they are echoes of devotion older than recorded memory. To modern historians, such mysteries are both maddening and magnetic. Each missing line in a text, each defaced relief, feels like a whisper just beyond comprehension. What power could make an entire god vanish from memory? And why, even after 2,000 years of silence, does the echo still remain? There is an unease in realizing that mythology, like history, is written by survivors. The gods who endured did so not by being stronger or more real, but by being useful. They aligned with kingdoms, with wars, with human ambition. The ones who spoke of stillness, of neutrality, of quiet observation, those were the first to be forgotten. The listener's disappearance, then, may tell us more about humanity than about divinity. Perhaps we fear silence because it holds a mirror too steady. If we could recover his name, would it change anything? Maybe it already lives within language itself, hidden in a word we speak without knowing. Myths often survive this way, in gestures, in idioms, in symbols stripped of meaning yet still carrying resonance. The lost god may be less gone than transformed, watching from the threshold of memory. The evidence remains circumstantial, scattered like bones across the Aegean. Yet when viewed together, they form a silhouette too distinct to dismiss. Somewhere beneath the marble, beneath the inscriptions and scholarly certainty, a presence hums softly. It does not ask to be believed, only remembered. And so we linger here, at the edge of history, listening to the silence that once had a name. The stones beneath our feet seem to pulse faintly, as if the earth itself still breathes that forgotten syllable. But the sound never quite reaches the ear, it stays just beyond, teasing the border of awareness. The trail does not end here. Where memory fails, there are always those who refuse to forget. Hidden among the hills and caves of the ancient world, small circles of believers continued to whisper his name long after it was forbidden. Their rituals would evolve, their symbols blend with others, yet their devotion endured through centuries of secrecy. We will follow them next, those who called themselves keepers of the forgotten flame. The trail of the erased god leads us away from marble cities and into the wilderness. Far beyond the reach of Athens or Delphi, where the land breaks into restless hills, there once stood small sanctuaries built of rough stone. No grand pillars, no bronze gates, only circles of rock and soot blackened by centuries of secret fire. It was here, the legends say, that the keepers tended their flame. They were not priests in the usual sense. They had no temples approved by kings, no hymns sanctioned by councils. They lived as wanderers, appearing in records only as rumors, strangers who arrived before harvest, who spoke softly, who left offerings of water and salt. The villagers called them listeners, a quiet order devoted to the god that time refused to name. They believed that silence itself was holy, that every sound born into the world required its shadow of stillness. To keep that balance was their calling. The stories of these keepers come from fragments, lines scratched into pottery, a handful of verses preserved in later Orphic texts. One fragment describes them gathering by moonlight, their faces hidden beneath pale veils, holding shallow bowls filled with oil. They would lower wicks into the oil and breathe across them until the flame caught. Then they would stand in complete stillness, watching the light tremble. The ritual was said to honor the god's endurance, the idea that even forgotten light still burns beneath the world's noise. Archaeologists have found remnants of their sanctuaries in the highlands of Arcadia and on the desolate slopes of Mount Ossa. Each site shares the same peculiar design: concentric rings of stones, an altar sunk into the earth rather than raised above it, and carvings of serpents twined into circles. The serpent, in this context, did not symbolize evil or deceit, but continuity, life devouring its own tail to begin again. In every age the symbol returned, unchanged, as if it had no need of permission. Among these ruins, a bronze disc was discovered, etched with faint inscriptions. The words translate roughly as, "He who hears between worlds." Scholars argue whether the phrase refers to a god or a principle, but the devotion behind it feels unmistakable. The keepers believed that silence was not emptiness, but awareness that the divine existed in the pause between heartbeat and breath. Their practices unsettled the official temples. To worship without sacrifice, to revere without petition, undermined the elaborate economy of priest and offering. Rumors spread that the keepers dealt in forbidden knowledge, that they summoned shades from the underworld, that they listened to voices best left unheard. Eventually, the high priests of Apollo declared their rites heretical. Some were hunted. Others vanished into mountain caves or sailed for distant islands. Yet the fires continued to appear, small circles of light glimpsed by shepherds, fading when approached. A few centuries later, faint echoes of their doctrine resurfaced in Orphic poetry. The Orphics spoke of purification through silence, of descending into darkness to find truth. Their hymns mention the listener beneath the veil and the holy stillness before the dawn. Whether these were direct inheritances or distant coincidences, the resemblance is too close to dismiss. The keepers' ideas had seeped into the bloodstream of Greek mysticism, hidden beneath the rhythm of sanctioned verse. Legends persist that a handful of their descendants traveled east after the persecutions. In Anatolia and along the Black Sea coast, archaeologists have uncovered symbols nearly identical to those found in Arcadia: the eye encircled by waves, the coiled serpent guarding a flame. Some suggest that the cult adapted, merging with local traditions and surviving under new names. Every culture, it seems, preserves a memory of those who guarded silence: the desert hermits of Egypt, the monastic dreamers of Cappadocia, the poets who wrote in riddles so their truth could slip past censors. One traveler's account from the 2nd century CE tells of meeting an old woman in Epirus who tended a fire that had burned for as long as anyone could remember. She refused payment, asking only that visitors stand quietly before it. When questioned whose flame it was, she replied, "It belongs to the one who still listens." Historians dismiss the story as folklore, yet her words echo the same idea whispered in the caves of Arcadia: a belief that divinity listens more than it speaks. The keeper's disappearance was gradual, like embers cooling beneath ash. By the early Christian era, their name had become synonymous with superstition. Their altars were dismantled, their symbols chiseled away, yet folklore continued to breathe around them. In some villages of northern Greece, the tradition of lighting a single silent candle at midnight on the solstice endures. The candle must not be blown out. It must fade on its own. Those who keep the custom say it honors the balance of light and shadow. None can recall when it began. Perhaps this is how memory survives, not through monuments, but through gestures repeated without knowing why. The keepers may have vanished, but their rhythm lingers in these quiet acts, like the faint hum inside a seashell long after the ocean is gone. Their greatest ritual was patience. They believed that every forgotten thing would one day rise again, as the sun returns after night. When the modern world rediscovers traces of them, inscriptions, half-erased symbols, unexplained fires, the reaction is always the same: curiosity mixed with unease. The rational mind wants explanations. The heart senses continuity. We may never know whether the keepers truly worshipped a single lost god or an idea of sacred silence. Perhaps both. The mystery endures precisely because it resists conclusion. Maybe they never disappeared. Maybe they simply learned to whisper in ways we no longer recognize, in the hush before dawn, in the moment a candle flickers for no reason, in the instinct to pause before speaking a sacred word. Some say the listener still walks the border between sound and silence, gathering the forgotten prayers of the world. And every so often, when the night is still enough, Someone hears a faint breath beside the wind, a reminder that not all flames go out when unobserved. The secret orders fade into legend, their stones scattered across forgotten hills. But their purpose remains etched into the rhythm of existence itself, to guard what cannot be spoken, to protect the stillness that gives meaning to every voice. As we step away from their shadowed sanctuaries, the air grows lighter, yet the silence they tended seems to follow. Soon, another question will rise from that silence, one that reaches beyond a single god or cult. Why do civilizations erase their own myths? What fear drives them to bury the very stories that once defined them? The answer lies just ahead, waiting beneath the dust of power and memory. The morning rises over the ruins of the agora. Columns stand like frozen verdicts, pale against the sky. In this quiet light, it is easy to forget that once, every stone here was an argument, every temple, a declaration of power. The air hums faintly with ghosts of debate, where priests and magistrates once decided not only laws of men, but laws of heaven. For in Greece, the boundary between politics and divinity was never truly drawn. The gods of Olympus were not chosen by faith alone. They were elected by necessity. Each city-state aligned itself with a patron whose nature mirrored its ambitions. Athens crowned Athena, goddess of intellect and measured warfare. Sparta raised Ares, embodiment of endurance and blood. Corinth bent its sails toward Poseidon, trading strength for favor at sea. Through these alliances, belief became structure myth, a constitution written in metaphor. But beneath this glittering order ran older currents. In the myths that preceded the Olympians, creation was raw and uncertain. The Earth Mother, the Titans, the deep spirits of water and sky, they represented forces that could not be ruled. When Homer and Hesiod shaped their verses, they did more than tell stories. They edited reality. Their poems drew borders around the divine, turning chaos into hierarchy, mystery into law. By their ink, the gods learned their place. Zeus became king, his thunder the seal of authority. His rule was not just celestial, it was political theater. Every monarch invoked his name to legitimize power. Every judgment claimed his echo. The image of Zeus enthroned was mirrored in the courts of men, where decrees descended like lightning. Yet even as his myths praised justice, they also warned against questioning order. The rebellion of Prometheus, the punishment of mortals who sought too much knowledge, these tales were lessons disguised as wonder. The poets called it balance, the priests called it harmony, but harmony often means silence imposed upon dissent. Where Zeus ruled through thunder, Athena brought reason and intelligence that served empire as well as virtue. Her wisdom guided generals and lawmakers, shaping a society that prized order above imagination. Temples rose in her name not merely to honor thought, but to discipline it. And then there was Apollo, radiant god of measure and prophecy. His music defined what was pure, his oracles what was permitted. Under his gaze, the Greeks refined their art, their geometry, their codes. But the same light that illuminates also blinds. Those who danced outside its geometry, the ecstatic followers of Dionysus, the wild maidens of Artemis, the nameless spirits of the countryside, were tolerated only so long as they remained spectacle, never structure. To control myth was to control meaning. Priests rewrote hymns. Poets aligned their patrons with celestial order. The chaotic voices of older deities, those who embodied transformation, fertility, or the restless night, were softened, tamed, or forgotten. A pantheon once fluid, as water hardened into marble. What had been many became 12. Consider how quickly a story can become a law. Once, the gods quarreled freely, their chaos reflecting the unpredictability of life. But as cities grew and armies marched, uncertainty became dangerous. People needed the comfort of order, the assurance that the heavens favored their system. Myths that supported obedience flourished. Those that celebrated rebellion decayed. The divine began to mirror bureaucracy. The lightning bolt became a scepter, the olive branch, a treaty. We like to imagine mythology as spontaneous inspiration, but it was also governance. When a king raised a temple, he raised a narrative. Each column proclaimed, "The world is as we say it is." Within that framework, the unpredictable god had no home. Stories of shape-shifting mothers or gods who wept for men blurred the clean hierarchy of Olympus. They were quietly erased, their sanctuaries dismantled, their rituals labeled superstition. Inscriptions from the 6th century BCE tell of unlawful worship. The phrase appears beside fines and punishments, suggesting that impiety was not disbelief, it was misalignment with the official divine order. To pray to the wrong god became a civic offense. The city and its deity were inseparable. Loyalty to one demanded loyalty to the other. The freedom to imagine new divinities, once humanity's oldest art, was narrowed into orthodoxy. Yet even within this rigid structure, the old breath persisted. Farmers whispered to nameless spirits before planting seed. Fishermen poured wine into the sea without naming the receiver. These gestures were fragments of an earlier world, acts of quiet defiance performed under the eyes of sanctioned gods. The Olympians ruled from their marble heights, but beneath them, the soil still remembered other names. What fascinates the historian is how complete the transformation appears, and yet how fragile it was. A myth repeated by authority gains power, but it also loses mystery. When belief becomes law, it begins to fossilize. The same poets who glorified Zeus also hinted at his decline. Aeschylus wrote that even gods must answer to fate. Beneath the surface of obedience, Greece carried an awareness that order is only temporary, that every empire, even divine, balances on forgetfulness. The politics of myth reveal a simple truth. Control of story is control of soul. By defining which gods could exist, rulers defined the limits of imagination. The public pantheon became a mirror of social hierarchy, male over female, mind over body, order over chaos. The primal deities who once embodied nature's cycles, birth and decay, became background noise, their temples absorbed or renamed. Still, mythology has a way of resisting confinement. The suppressed elements do not vanish, they migrate. The wildness of Dionysus returned in secret festivals. The compassion of forgotten earth mothers re-emerged in small household shrines to Demeter. Every act of devotion carried a trace of rebellion, a quiet reminder that divinity does not obey decrees. As centuries passed, the polished myths of Homer and Hesiod became textbooks. Children recited them as moral instruction, citizens quoted them as law. But within the cracks of memory, a few scholars and poets sensed the missing voices. They saw the gaps where names had been scraped away, the inconsistencies that hinted at older truths. Their questions stirred discomfort. Who decides which gods get to exist, and what is lost when mystery is replaced by certainty? Standing again among the ruins, one begins to feel the tension between those who built the temples and those whose stories were buried beneath them. Each column becomes a monument not only to belief, but to exclusion. The perfection of the marble hides the struggle that shaped it, the silenced myths that could not serve the city. Somewhere among those erased stories lies the tale of a goddess twice forgotten, once by the poets who replaced her with a king of seas, and again by time itself. Her name drifts through inscriptions like foam dissolving on water, faint but insistent. If we listen closely, perhaps the waves still speak it. And so the thunder of Zeus fades into the hush of the ocean, where another presence waits to be remembered. The law of gods yields to the rhythm of tides, and the next story begins. The sound of waves replaces the echo of marble halls. Dawn spills over the Aegean like liquid glass, revealing a coast littered with broken columns and shards of blue-green tile. The wind moves through the ruins with a voice that seems older than language. Once, this shore belonged to a goddess who ruled not with thunder or trident, but with memory. The people called her by many names, some lost, some half-remembered, but all meant the same thing. She who listens to the sea. Long before Poseidon brandished his horse and spear, the sea had another face. Her power was not conquest, but remembrance. Fishermen left small shells at her shrines so that she might recall their names when storms rose. Women whispered to her when the tides carried their husbands away, trusting that her memory would bring them home. In every story she was gentle, patient, and vast, an ocean mind that kept account of every life it touched. The waves were said to echo her breathing. Archaeologists piecing together fragments along this coast speak of sanctuaries carved directly into the cliffs. Offerings were laid in shallow pools that filled with tide water, so that her blessing literally washed over them. On one stone block near ancient Myrina, the faint outline of a woman's face survives, her eyes closed as if listening. Beneath it runs an inscription eroded almost to nothing, a few surviving letters forming the word Mnema, memory. Perhaps this was her temple's name, the House of Remembering. When the cult of Poseidon rose, her image began to fade. The new god came with symbols of motion and domination, horses, chariots, earthquakes. The calm sea that listened was replaced by one that obeyed. Priests rewrote prayers, replacing her gentle verbs of hearing and recalling with commands for protection and victory. The trident supplanted the shell. The old goddess was not slain, she was absorbed, her qualities redistributed among the masculine pantheon like pearls scattered into surf. Yet the ocean kept her secret. Beneath every storm, there is a still layer where sound travels farther than on the surface. Sailors who survived tempests swore they heard voices in that quiet depth, a hum that felt like remembering. Even centuries later, coastal villagers spoke of the lady below, to whom they poured the first cup of wine at feasts. Official religion called it superstition, families called it tradition. Such is the persistence of reverence once rooted in the tides. In one ancient hymn, found on a papyrus blackened by fire, a single stanza remains. She who gathers what is lost, who counts the fallen foam. The rhythm is soft. Unlike the triumphal hymns of later temples, it is almost a lullaby, perhaps sung by mothers to children when the sea wind moaned through the shutters. This tone, half prayer, half comfort, suggests the nature of her worship. She was not a goddess of fear, but of continuity. To her, nothing was ever truly gone. It only returned in another form. The tragedy of her disappearance reveals more than the loss of a deity. It exposes the shifting heart of civilization itself. As Greece grew more certain of its order, it began to fear the idea of endless return. The male gods claimed the seas, the skies, the earth, each defined by command. A goddess who merely listened threatened that hierarchy. To remember everything is to forgive everything, and forgiveness has no place in empires. And so the poets of the New Age wrote her out, transforming the ocean from memory into weapon. But myths resist deletion. The sea remembers even when men forget. Along remote islands, divers still bring up amulets shaped like ears of shell. The symbolism is unmistakable, the listening ocean, the compassionate witness. Some of these artifacts date to centuries after her cult was thought extinct. Perhaps they were keepsakes of sailors who believed that somewhere beneath the roaring waves, a quiet presence still kept count of them. There is a certain sadness in imagining her final temples. Picture the priests extinguishing lamps as imperial edicts spread, their sacred pools filled with rubble, the hymns replaced by prayers to Poseidon. Yet even as the marble cracked and salt reclaimed the floor, water continued to seep in, reflecting the sky as it always had. In that reflection lived her last sermon. That memory cannot be destroyed, only hidden. The few surviving myths that mention her describe her retreat, not her death. One fragment says she folded herself into the sea's own heart and slept. Another claims that during great storms, Her voice can still be heard beneath Poseidon's rage, a low, sustained tone that steadies the waves once the thunder ends. Perhaps she became the calm after violence, the moment of silence that allows life to begin again. For those listening now, her story carries a quiet challenge. Every age chooses which memories to preserve and which to drown. In forgetting her, Greece traded reflection for authority, empathy for order. Yet the old sea does not judge, it simply holds. Each wave that breaks on these ruins feels like a pulse from her enduring heart, reminding us that nothing truly erased ever stops existing. It only changes the depth at which it hides. As twilight returns, the horizon blushes silver. The stones glow faintly, as if wet from an unseen tide. The wind lifts a thin spray across the beach, salt crystallizing on the lips. In that taste is the same element she once embodied, memory made tangible. For a brief moment, you can almost sense her presence in the hush between waves, the soft inhalation of the sea before it exhales again. She listens still, patient and unseen, a goddess without a temple yet richer than any king. Before Poseidon ruled the waves, someone else listened to the sea. She endures in the rhythm that steadies every shore, in the pause between crash and retreat. And perhaps she endures within us too, in the way we grieve and remember, in the instinct to speak softly to water as if it might reply. The Greeks may have buried her name beneath marble and law, but the ocean has never ceased to pronounce it in its own language. The tide swells once more, drawing our gaze outward. From this forgotten coast, the horizon widens toward distant lands where philosophers and dreamers will soon seek meaning in the ruins of myth. The sea carries us onward, its pulse becoming the beat of oars, its whisper the promise of another revelation. What began as worship becomes journey, and the journey leads toward understanding. The waves fade into the rhythm of travel, guiding us to those who would question why such gods were lost at all and what it means to remember them again. The scene shifts from sea spray to the still air of a stone courtyard in Athens. The city murmurs below, but here on the hill the sound softens into thought. A few students sit in semicircle around their teacher, a man whose eyes hold the far horizon even when fixed on the ground. The world will remember him as Plato. Around him, words rise and fall like the pulse of the wind. Ideas, ideals, and always stories. For all his love of logic, Plato never abandoned myth. To him, story was not ornament but vessel. In dialogue after dialogue, gods and heroes appear as if summoned from smoke, carrying truths too fragile for plain argument. He used the language of imagination to speak of things reason could only circle. Yet within that balance, something curious stirs. Beneath the allegories of his Republic and the crystalline geometry of the Timaeus, faint echoes of older, stranger voices remain as though philosophy itself were a mask for forgotten prayer. He taught that the soul existed before birth, that knowledge was remembrance. To learn was to recollect what the soul once knew but had forgotten. The idea seems pure philosophy, yet listen closely, and another rhythm emerges. It sounds like the hymn of that ancient sea goddess of memory, the one who gathered what was lost. Was Plato, knowingly or not, retelling a myth already erased? When he spoke of the eternal realm of forms, the unseen originals of all visible things, was he reshaping the old belief in divine prototypes, the first patterns sung by gods before the world began? Plato's genius was translation. He took the language of ritual and rendered it into thought. But translation is always transformation. In refining myth into philosophy, he polished away the texture of mystery. The living gods became metaphors. The sacred became abstract. The philosophers would call this progress. Yet progress often begins with forgetting. Imagine his dialogues as layered frescoes. Beneath the smooth paint of reason lie older sketches, shadowed outlines of titans, mothers of earth, and whispering spirits between worlds. Occasionally the underdrawing shows through, a faint color bleeding past logic's edge. In the Phaedrus, He describes the soul as a winged chariot rising toward truth, yet weighed down by earthly desire. To the casual reader, it is allegory. To one who listens, it is myth reborn. The flight of the soul echoes the ascent of Orpheus, the descent of Persephone, the endless rhythm of return. Perhaps Plato knew exactly what he was doing. Perhaps he inherited fragments of forbidden lore from the mystery schools that flourished around Athens, Eleusis, Delphi, Orphic brotherhoods. He was initiated, they say, though he never spoke of what he saw. The laws of silence bound every initiate, but philosophers have their own ways of concealment. A concept, after all, can hide a secret as effectively as any cipher. By transforming divine mysteries into metaphysical ideas, Plato could preserve their essence without defying the law. The sacred survived behind the veil of abstraction. He often warned against the poets, accusing them of deceiving the mind with imitation. Yet his own dialogues perform the same enchantment. They lure the listener through narrative into revelation. When he speaks of Atlantis, a shining world drowned for its arrogance, he frames it as a political parable. But the tone betrays him. He writes as if describing memory, not invention. The lost island becomes more than allegory. It becomes a mirror to all civilizations that mistake power for wisdom. And once again, the question arises: did he invent the story, or inherit it from myths already censored by the guardians of the new order? In his academy, knowledge was pursuit of the divine, not escape from it. He believed truth was beautiful, and beauty truthful, an idea both rational and mystical. Each student was urged to look inward until he recognized eternity reflecting back. To think deeply enough was to pray. But even here, shadows lengthened. As logic triumphed, the gods retreated further into symbol. What had once been worship became geometry. The sacred fire became theorem. Plato sought to purify the human soul, yet in doing so he purified the cosmos of its many voices. Still, he could never quite silence them. In the Symposium, while discussing love, he allows a woman, Diotima, to instruct Socrates in divine mysteries. Her words shimmer with reverence for birth, transformation, and continuity, the very themes once sung to the lost god of silence and the listening sea. Through her, a forgotten lineage speaks again, momentarily unafraid. When she vanishes from the dialogue, the echo of her teaching lingers like perfume on parchment, a reminder of the feminine wisdom philosophy tried to disguise. The paradox of Plato is this: he sought absolute truth, yet his method depended on metaphor. His logic was scaffolded by story. Without myth, his philosophy would collapse into silence, and perhaps that is the deepest secret of all. Maybe he understood that reason alone cannot contain reality, that the mind, to reach truth, must travel the same paths once walked by gods. To read him today is to feel two currents crossing beneath the text. One flows upward, clear and bright, the rational search for perfection. The other runs deep and dark, an older memory tugging from below. Together they form the pulse of Western thought, a dialogue between light and shadow that never truly ends. Every age rediscovers this tension and calls it new. Every thinker rebuilds the same bridge between myth and meaning. If philosophy is the child of myth, then Plato was both heir and undertaker. He preserved the bones but buried the body. His work made possible all future reasoning, yet it also sealed away the world's enchantment. To study him is to walk through a temple stripped of idols, but still scented with incense. The absence itself becomes holy. And so the question lingers like a whisper under marble arches. What if philosophy was built on stories no one was meant to remember? What if every argument hides a prayer, every theorem a lament? Beneath the dialogue's calm symmetry lies the same yearning that shaped the first myths, the need to understand why we are here and why the silence listens back. As the afternoon light fades across the courtyard, the philosopher's students rise, still arguing, still dreaming of perfection. Their voices drift into the streets, mingling with the hum of market and temple. Thought and worship intertwine again, indistinguishable, eternal. The mind of Plato closes its eyes, and the world turns quietly in reflection. But not all chose the safety of silence. Some refused to bury their gods beneath logic. They found new ways to speak of forbidden things, ways that hid truth behind rhythm and rhyme, disguising revelation as song. The next voice we hear will not be a philosopher's, but a poet's. Night has fallen again, and with it comes the sound of words meant to be felt rather than understood. The philosophers built their temples from logic, but the poets built theirs from silence and breath. When the gods were forbidden, poetry became their last disguise. Each line carried a secret too delicate for open speech, a fragment of truth woven into beauty. So only the dreamers would hear it. In the candlelit halls of Thebes and Corinth, men like Pindar sang praises to kings and athletes, yet beneath their victories lay another message. His odes spoke of glory, but they pulsed with something deeper, the memory of divine ancestry. Every mortal triumph, he wrote, was merely the echo of a forgotten god within the blood. He praised the speed of chariots and the wisdom of statesmen, but his rhythm carried a second beat, that of eternity, murmuring through the veins of humankind. Pindar's verses shimmer with restraint. He never says directly what he means. He alludes. He dances around it, trusting the initiated to catch the shimmer between words. One stanza speaks of the hidden root that feeds the olive's crown. Scholars interpret it as metaphor for discipline, but those who study the mystery traditions hear another message, that beneath the cultivated surface of the world lies an older power, unacknowledged yet essential. To praise the root was to praise what official religion ignored, the ancient, feminine soil of creation. After Pindar came the Orphics, a brotherhood of visionaries and wanderers who claimed that poetry could open the gates of death. They wrote in riddles, teaching that the soul, trapped in mortal form, could remember its divine origin through song. Their hymns sound serene to modern ears, but to ancient authorities they were dangerous. The Orphics whispered of gods who had died and been reborn, of worlds that reset in endless cycles. They rejected the rigid hierarchy of Olympus and replaced it with harmony, a universe where every creature, every atom, was part of one resonant chord. Their greatest secret was not immortality but memory. They believed that to sing was to remember the pattern of the cosmos, the same pattern the forbidden philosophers had hidden in their geometry. When an Orphic poet wrote, "I am a child of earth and of starry heaven, but my race is of heaven alone," he was not boasting, he was confessing. It was an initiation verse, meant to remind the dying that their essence came from beyond the gods of state and temple. These lines were passed hand to hand, copied on scraps of gold leaf small enough to hide in a tomb. Some were placed on the tongues of the dead, so that when they crossed into the underworld, they could recite the words like a password, a song to prove they had once known the truth. Even in death, the poets kept their rebellion quiet, veiled in music. The rhythm of their secrecy was contagious. Later poets adopted the same double-language surface praise and hidden defiance. Sappho's fragments, for instance, often read like simple hymns to love, yet her diction borrows directly from pre-Olympian invocations of the goddess as life itself. She writes, "Come to me once more, release me from longing," a line that scholars call romantic, but which, to older ears, sounds like invocation. She was calling not to a mortal lover, but to a divine presence that had been denied her, a goddess erased by more masculine pantheons. Her voice, trembling with vulnerability, kept that spirit alive through tenderness. In this way, poetry became a secret archive. Each generation added new disguises, turning myth into metaphor, religion into rhythm. A reader might not understand the hidden pulse, but the heart would. Even centuries later, when Christianity began to overwrite the last pagan verses, the same structure survived. Hymns replaced hymns. Prayers adopted the same cadences as the Orphic songs they condemned. Words change, but rhythm remembers. To listen to these poems aloud is to hear two conversations at once. On the surface, they speak of honor, beauty, and divine justice. Beneath, they whisper of the erased gods, the listener, the sea mother, the shadowed presence between worlds. The poets could not name them, but their music carried the outline of their forms. Each metaphor became a doorway, each refrain a coded invocation. Those who truly listened could still feel the old divinities breathing through the syllables. The courage of these poets lay not in open rebellion but in subtlety. They understood that a secret survives best when hidden inside what appears harmless. Their words were gifts wrapped in gold, their meanings layered like the shells of an ancient spiral. They trusted that someday someone would unwrap them. Perhaps that is why we still read them at night, when the mind drifts toward the border between clarity and dream. When Pindar writes of men born twice, he could mean heroes reborn through glory or souls reincarnated through remembrance. When the Orphics describe a silver wheel that turns without ceasing, it could be the moon, or the endless rhythm of creation renewing itself beyond the reach of sanctioned theology. Every symbol is an act of defiance, every rhyme a seed smuggled through censorship. The more the official world sought to rationalize myth, the more poetry leaned toward shadow. It preserved the irrational as sacred. It spoke of love that transcended law, of death as transformation, of gods that listened rather than ruled. In doing so, it became the bridge between the age of worship and the age of silence. Without these verses, the memory of the forbidden myths might have vanished entirely. Through them, it still hums, disguised as beauty. To the late-night listener, the effect is mesmerizing. One can feel how the poets wrote not for their time but for ours, for those awake in the dark, searching for meaning beyond the literal. Their code was meant to be rediscovered by hearts that refused to forget wonder. Each stanza becomes a whisper from antiquity saying, "Do not believe the marble. The gods are still in the dust." And when the music ends, a hush lingers, a silence thick with memory. Through it, we begin to sense the slow dimming of that poetic age. The philosophers had reasoned the sacred into abstraction. The poets had hidden it in verse. But even those coded songs would not last forever. The next chapters of history would bring fires, wars, and the final triumph of forgetfulness. The voices would grow quieter, the manuscripts fewer. Myths would slip into sleep. Yet for now, their rhythm continues to echo a secret heartbeat beneath centuries of silence, guiding us gently toward that moment when the old stories fall completely still, waiting for rediscovery. We descend with them now, into the hush of forgetting. The wind that once carried hymns now carries smoke. Time turns its pages, and the world forgets, not with silence, but with fire. Somewhere along the line between devotion and empire, the scrolls that held the stories of gods, dreams, and beginnings began to vanish. Not by accident, not by age alone, but by choice. The story begins, as so many do, in Alexandria, a city built for memory, where the entire world once tried to write itself down. Within its marble halls and cedar shelves, hundreds of thousands of scrolls whispered in unison the breath of civilizations sharing space. Egyptian priests, Greek philosophers, Persian mystics, even the lost tongues of the Phoenicians all lived together beneath the same roof. If ever the gods of knowledge had a temple, this was it. And then it burned. Not once, but many times. No one can say which flame was the true destroyer. Perhaps it was Caesar's war, or the riots, or the decree of a fearful ruler. The histories blur, each scribe rewriting blame as the centuries pass. What remains certain is the smoke. Witnesses said it rose for weeks, turning the sky the color of bruised gold. They said the fire burned so hot that it seemed to consume the horizon itself. And within that fire, something larger than parchment perished the very memory of what humanity once knew. It's comforting to imagine that all knowledge can be recovered, that somewhere a copy always survives. But the truth is harsher. When those shelves fell, countless voices went silent forever. Myths older than Greece, hymns from forgotten kingdoms, treatises on stars and souls all became ash. What we now call the history of thought is only what escaped. Every surviving scroll is a survivor by accident, a refugee of fire. The destruction of Alexandria was not an isolated tragedy. It was a pattern repeated across continents and centuries. Temples looted, libraries cleansed, memories rewritten under new gods and empires. The conqueror does not simply claim land, he claims imagination. By choosing which stories to preserve, he defines what the world is allowed to remember. Knowledge is never neutral. It carries allegiance. And in the ancient world, allegiance meant survival. Imagine the monks who copied texts by candlelight centuries later. They decided which myths were safe, which could be reinterpreted into moral lessons, and which were too dangerous to exist. A single omission could erase a deity. A mistranslation could turn wisdom into heresy. And because these decisions were made quietly, behind monastery walls, no one could ever know what was lost. The fire of forgetting does not always glow in plain sight. Sometimes it flickers in the mind of a cautious scribe, extinguishing truth with a stroke of ink. Outside, history marched on. Empires fell, languages blended, and the chain of oral tradition, the heartbeat of myth, grew weaker. Once, stories passed from voice to voice like living flame. But each retelling requires both speaker and listener, and both must care enough to remember. As cities rose and scholars turned from chant to record, memory became fragile, dependent on material that could burn. What survived did so through chance. A scroll hidden in sand, a tablet buried in flood, a name carved in stone. All else dissolved into smoke and rumor. We imagine loss as sudden, but forgetting is often slow. A myth untold for one generation becomes uncertain in the next, then incomprehensible, and finally absurd. The divine fades into metaphor, the metaphor into trivia. By the time scholars attempt to recover meaning, the soul of the story is gone. Only the skeleton remains. We study ruins, never the living city. Perhaps this is why the image of the burning library haunts us so deeply. It is not only about books, it is about the fragility of our link to wonder. Every flame that devours knowledge also devours possibility, the versions of the world we will never see again. The gods that might have taught compassion instead of conquest. The philosophers who might have reconciled spirit and science before they became enemies. The poets whose words might have healed the fracture between dream and reason. All of them drift upward with the smoke. Some say that Alexandria's librarians tried to save what they could, copying scrolls onto small tablets, hiding them in sealed jars, burying them beneath the harbor walls. Divers have searched for them for centuries, finding nothing but shards of pottery. Yet the rumor persists, because humanity cannot bear to believe that its greatest memory vanished without trace. We invent hope to fill the silence. If you stand on that coast today, the sea murmurs against the stones with a sound like turning pages. The harbor has shifted, the city rebuilt, but beneath the waves lie layers of ash that once were words. You can almost imagine the echoes of reading voices reciting to no one, syllables dissolving into the tide. Perhaps this is how knowledge truly survives, not in the permanence of paper, but in the longing it leaves behind. Every generation that seeks wisdom is, in some way, rebuilding that library in its mind. Still, one cannot escape the question: how much of what we call truth is only the residue of what survived? If entire worlds of knowledge can vanish in a single blaze, then every page we read is an act of faith. We believe that the fragments tell enough of the story that the pattern can be discerned through loss. But fire is not an editor, it is an eraser. It removes without reason, leaving us to mistake what remains for completion. There is a strange comfort, too, in this fragility. If memory can vanish, it can also return. Ash is not absence, it is transformation. The stories burned at Alexandria may live again, scattered as particles of inspiration, igniting in new minds. Perhaps the myths we invent today about science, cosmos, or creation carry traces of those lost worlds. The fire destroyed, but it also dispersed. Somewhere in the dust of its smoke, imagination survived. What if entire worlds vanished in the smoke of one forgotten fire? The thought lingers, heavy and beautiful. The wind stirs, and for a heartbeat, it seems to carry the scent of old parchment, the faint murmur of voices refusing to die. Out of this darkness, something small begins to glow, a flicker in the ruins, a whisper among the ashes. It is not the return of what was lost, but the recognition that loss itself has a memory. And if dust can remember, then perhaps nothing is ever truly gone. At first, there is only silence, the kind that follows endings. The fires have long cooled, and the winds that scattered the ashes have settled into stillness. Yet somewhere within that quiet, something begins to stir. Beneath the dust of centuries, fragments shift against one another like bones remembering how to speak. The world, it seems, never forgets completely. It starts with a shard of pottery. Found by accident near the ruins of a forgotten port, its glaze holds faint lines that do not match any known alphabet. At first, the archaeologists assume it is decorative, but under magnification, the marks reveal rhythm, repetition, spacing, a pattern that feels intentional. A song, perhaps, or a prayer. They call in linguists, who stare for hours at the symbols without recognition. The shard sits between them, quiet as a secret refusing translation. Yet in that refusal, meaning begins to form. The mystery itself becomes message, that language, like memory, can survive without being understood. Soon, other discoveries follow. A papyrus fragment unearthed in the dry sands of Egypt bears a single verse. The sea has many names, but remembers one face. No author, no title, only that line. Its simplicity haunts the scholars who find it. It echoes the myths of the goddess of the forgotten sea, yet predates any known text about her by centuries. Perhaps it was copied from an older tradition. Perhaps it was all that survived of a lost hymn. The words tremble like a voice carried too far on the wind. Elsewhere, a clay tablet emerges from the ground during construction in Anatolia. Half its surface is smooth, the other etched with a spiral pattern similar to the sigil found in Orphic graves. When light strikes it at dusk, the grooves glimmer faintly as though dust itself remembers fire. No translation follows, only reverence. The archaeologists, despite their training, hesitate to clean it. They speak in whispers around it, as if afraid the silence might answer back. Every discovery feels less like revelation and more like recognition. We are not uncovering new stories. We are rediscovering what once shaped us. The dust, patient and impartial, has preserved more than stone. It has preserved emotion, the human need to remember, to believe that meaning outlives destruction. Each fragment carries not just information, but the ghost of intent. Someone, somewhere, once wanted us to find it. The field journals of these archaeologists read like poetry. One writes, "The earth does not bury, it cradles." Another notes how, when brushing sand away from a broken amphora, she heard what sounded like a sigh. Science explains it as the release of air from ancient clay, but the feeling remains a sense that the past is exhaling into the present. Every artifact becomes a voice emerging from a long sleep. Among the most haunting discoveries is a small bronze mirror found near the island of Lesbos. Its surface is almost completely darkened by age, but faint inscriptions curl along the rim. Look and remember. The letters belong to no single dialect, a fusion of Ionian and something older. Some believe it belonged to a poet, perhaps one who hid forbidden verses in the reflection itself. When polished, the mirror offers no clear image, only blurred shapes that shift like water. But in candlelight, observers claim they can see lines of script appear and vanish, too fast to read. Optical illusion, perhaps, or maybe the memory of words that refuse to die quietly. What fascinates us most is not certainty, but possibility. These remnants whisper without demanding belief. They remind us that the world once contained more imagination than evidence, and that the border between the two has always been porous. In the fragments of forgotten myth, science and spirit meet halfway, each humbled by the persistence of the other. The act of excavation becomes almost devotional. The archaeologist kneels where a storyteller once stood, separated by 1,000 years of silence. The brush sweeps gently, revealing not treasure but context, the curve of a vessel, the faint outline of a word. In those small discoveries, entire worlds unfold. A single symbol may suggest a pantheon. A shard may imply a ceremony. A fragment of song may illuminate an entire theology. Nothing is whole, yet everything connects. It is as if the dust itself has been waiting for someone patient enough to listen. Sometimes, late at night, these researchers speak of sensations they cannot explain, the feeling of being observed, of presence in the ruins. Rational minds dismiss it as imagination, but the emotion lingers. It is difficult to stand amid so much forgotten devotion without feeling that some trace of divinity remains. Perhaps consciousness leaves residue, the way scent clings to fabric. Perhaps the gods we lost were not destroyed, merely diffused, woven into the air we breathe, the soil we disturb, the rhythm of discovery itself. There is comfort in this thought. Each fragment reminds us that erasure is never absolute. The same forces that bury also protect. Fire consumes, but ash preserves outlines. Sand erases, but also conceals. Memory's greatest ally is time itself, for time forgets unevenly. What seems lost to one age may rise in another, translated not by scholars but by intuition. A child staring at the sea, a dreamer tracing patterns in stone. These two are archaeologists of spirit. Sometimes the dust remembers more than the living ever could. It remembers how stories feel, not just what they mean. When a fragment resurfaces, it does not restore the past. It reawakens the capacity for wonder. The listener becomes participant, completing what time left unfinished. In that sense, every discovery is also a collaboration between eras, the ancients whispering, the moderns answering. The tone of the world shifts gently from mourning to awe. The ruins no longer seem like graves but archives, waiting to be reread by hearts attuned to mystery. What burned in Alexandria may rise again, not in the form of scrolls, but in the minds of those who seek. Knowledge changes shape, memory changes hands. The important thing is that it continues. And so the dust, once heavy with loss, begins to glow with purpose. The silence that followed the fires transforms into a murmur of rediscovery. We begin to see how even forgetting has a rhythm, one that allows remembrance to return at its own pace when the world is ready to listen again. The archaeologists close their journals. The night wind brushes across the excavation site, stirring loose grains of sand that shimmer briefly before settling again. The camera lingers on a single fragment half buried, its symbols catching the moonlight. The voice of the narrator softens, almost tender. Out of darkness, light. Out of loss, the faintest echo of continuity. These rediscovered whispers will guide us onward to an age not of ruin, but of reflection. For when the dust learns to speak, the world begins to remember. The world changes its language, but its symbols seldom die. A new empire rises, a new faith takes hold, and yet the same shapes linger: the serpent, the halo, the flame. The marble crumbles, the names vanish, but the pattern persists. Beneath every modern ritual lies an echo, faint but insistent. The old gods do not disappear. They adapt. Like actors in a vast, eternal play, they exchange costumes, waiting for the next cue to speak. When the Greeks became Romans, their myths did not vanish, they multiplied. Zeus became Jupiter, Athena turned to Minerva, Poseidon to Neptune. The faces changed, the accents softened, but the essence remained. The Romans, practical as they were, treated divinity like architecture. If something worked, they reinforced it. If it threatened the structure, they buried it beneath new stone. Yet even in this pragmatic pantheon, the whispers of older worship survived the nameless powers of hearth and harvest, of storm and silence, folded neatly into the language of empire. Then came the age of the single god. Monotheism swept across the old world like a tide erasing footprints. The temples fell quiet, their idols buried, their hymns forbidden. But even then, the stories refused extinction. They hid themselves within saints, angels, and demons, taking shelter in the imagination of the very faith that sought to replace them. A thunder-wielding patriarch became the image of divine authority. The compassionate mother transformed into a virgin cloaked in blue. The god of wild places was cast into shadow, renamed as something to fear. Each transformation carried both survival and disguise. In the hills of Greece, villagers still light candles to Saint Nicholas, the patron of sailors, whose festival coincides with ancient rites once offered to Poseidon. The waters are blessed, the nets lowered, the prayers almost identical, only the name has changed. In mountain chapels, Saint Elias reigns over thunder and fire, his altars built where shrines to Zeus once stood. The faithful climb the same peaks, uttering new prayers along old paths. Even the goddess of memory has her shadow in Christian devotion. Saint Neme, obscure and gentle, protector of poets and the dying. The old world lingers not in rebellion, but in adaptation. Folk traditions carry this inheritance most openly. Across the Mediterranean, festivals blur the line between sacred and ancient. On midsummer nights, bonfires blaze, wreaths of herbs are thrown into rivers, and people leap through flames for luck. Officially, these acts honor saints. Unofficially, they honor continuity. The participants may not know the names of the gods they echo, yet their bodies remember. The gestures themselves are older than doctrine movements passed through blood, older than writing, immune to censorship. Even language preserves the divine. The words we use for virtue, for love, for fate all carry myth beneath their surface. Muse once meant a literal goddess of inspiration. Now it means the spark of creativity. Panic was the touch of Pan's wild fear, spreading through flocks and men alike. Echo, the nymph who faded into voice alone, survives each time sound repeats itself. The dictionary becomes a graveyard and a resurrection site at once. There is a quiet irony in how the most enduring gods are the ones we no longer believe in. Freed from dogma, they slip unnoticed into every culture, every art. Painters give them halos instead of laurel crowns. Composers invoke them through symphonies. Writers resurrect them in allegory. The mythic becomes psychological. The divine becomes archetypal. Carl Jung would later call these forms primordial images, patterns of the collective unconscious. Yet the poets knew long before psychology gave it a name, that humanity never invents its gods, it only renames them. Walk through any cathedral built upon a pagan site, and you can feel the negotiation between old and new. Beneath the polished marble floors lie the foundations of forgotten altars. The architecture lifts the soul upward, but the stones pull it down. Light streams through stained glass depicting angels, yet their poses mirror the winged figures carved 2,000 years before. The faithful kneel, unaware they are kneeling to both heaven and memory. This layering of belief is not deception, it is survival. Every culture must balance reverence with renewal. When an old god becomes a saint, when a forbidden myth turns into parable, it is not erasure, it is reincarnation. The divine adjusts to our vocabulary, meeting us where we are willing to listen. Perhaps the listener himself, that erased god of silence, lives on in our sense of conscience, that quiet voice between thought and action. Perhaps the sea goddess breathes in every ritual of cleansing, every baptism where water remembers its sanctity. In remote places, the masks are thinner. In rural Italy, peasants still tell stories of La Signora del Bosco, the Lady of the Woods, who blesses hunters that respect her trees. She is called a spirit now, not a goddess, but her lineage is clear, a fragment of Artemis wandering beneath a different moon. In northern Greece, old women hang amulets shaped like eyes above doorways to ward off envy. They call it mati, but the symbol predates Christianity by millennia. It was once the mark of the listener, the unseen watcher between gods and men. Even in cities of glass and steel, the pattern continues. We speak of technology as omniscient, of markets as invisible hands, of fame as immortality. The language of gods has not disappeared. It has simply migrated to new altars. Our skyscrapers mirror the ambition of Babel. Our screens glow with a light once reserved for the sacred. We have not abandoned myth, we have updated it. Every advertisement promising transformation, every story of redemption, every hero's journey that fills our films, these are the modern hymns of continuity. Maybe the gods never left. Maybe they just learned our language. They walk unnoticed through the rhythms of our days, hiding in rituals we call habits, in symbols we call brands, in emotions we call inspiration. The divine adapts because we do. When we forget one form, it assumes another. When we silence one name, it finds a new tongue. And each time we believe we have outgrown mythology, it grows within us instead, as imagination, as longing, as art. Myth is not history, it is inheritance. It moves through time like a current beneath the surface of belief, pulling us gently toward origins we no longer remember. The masks change, but the gaze behind them remains the same, patient, watchful, eternal. From these lingering faces of the past emerges a new kind of seeker, not priests or philosophers, but dreamers who sense that the silence around them still listens. In the next age, these dreamers will begin to hear faint voices again, calling from the threshold between sleep and waking. Their visions will blur the line between imagination and remembrance. And when they speak, it will not sound like worship, but like rediscovery. The world grew louder, yet some still heard whispers beneath the noise. As cities brightened and engines replaced thunder, there remained a few who claimed the silence still spoke, that between the hum of electricity and the turning of thought, an older rhythm survived. These were the dreamers of the modern age, poets, mystics, and seekers who felt that forgotten gods were not dead, only dreaming within us. They did not find their revelations in temples or ruins, but in night itself. When the rest of the world slept, they listened to dreams, to music, to intuition that felt not invented but inherited. Some wrote that inspiration struck like lightning, others confessed it came like memory. The words arrived whole, as if dictated by unseen hands. The rational mind dismissed this as imagination, yet the feeling persisted, that creation was remembrance. In the late 19th century, as science mapped the heavens and declared them empty of gods, the symbolists of Europe began to refill that void with meaning. Writers like Yeats, Rilke, and Mallarmé spoke of visions, of veiled presences behind ordinary life. They did not pray, they translated. Their poems became seances of language, drawing echoes from the past into the living world. Rilke wrote of the gods who will return when we prepare them a dwelling in our hearts. Yeats built entire rituals to awaken what he called the sleeping company. To them, myth was not memory, it was prophecy delayed. As the century turned, dream replaced ritual. Psychoanalysis entered the scene. claiming to interpret what religion once revered. Sigmund Freud spoke of the unconscious as a storehouse of buried desire, but his student Carl Jung saw deeper. He called it a library of symbols, a collective inheritance of stories that humanity had forgotten it knew. The gods, he said, had not vanished. They had become psychological. Zeus, Athena, and the listener alike now lived in the architecture of the mind, surfacing through art and vision. To dream, then, was to converse with eternity. This idea spread quietly, finding kindred spirits in painters and composers. Surrealists like Salvador Dalí, inspired by dreams and myth, painted landscapes that seemed both ancient and unborn. Their canvases glimmered with echoes of Atlantis and the underworld worlds that Plato had confined to allegory, now resurrected in pigment and line. Musicians like Debussy, and later Stravinsky, wove mythic motifs into sound, turning orchestras into modern temples. The ancient gods, it seemed, had traded marble for imagination. Yet not all who listened found comfort. The same visions that inspired wonder sometimes brought unease. Jung wrote that the gods returned as neuroses, that when societies deny the sacred, it reappears as anxiety, restlessness, obsession. In this light, the dreamers were not mad prophets but translators of imbalance, voicing what the collective soul refused to admit. Even nightmares carried fragments of divinity. In dreams of drowning, one might glimpse the lost sea goddess. In dreams of silence, the listener waiting patiently in the void. Throughout the 20th century, artists continued to act as intermediaries between the visible and invisible. T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land lamented a modern world bereft of gods, yet filled with their ghosts. Joseph Campbell, studying myths across continents, discovered patterns that transcended culture. He called them archetypes, but the mystics knew them by older names: the wanderer, the mother, the redeemer, the trickster. These were not inventions but rediscoveries, recurring dreams shared by humanity across time. Campbell's work rekindled interest in myth not as fantasy, but as a mirror of the human condition. In the quiet decades that followed, new kinds of seekers emerged, not scholars or priests, but ordinary people drawn to mystery in a world that claimed to have outgrown it. They found fragments of divinity in meditation, in music, in the quiet pulse between breaths. The spiritual and the psychological began to blend, forming a new language of awakening. People spoke of energy, vibration, consciousness, modern words for ancient presences. The listener had learned yet another dialect. Technology, too, became part of the transformation. The digital age created endless networks of communication, but also new forms of isolation. Dreams shifted onto screens, yet even there, symbols reappeared. The serpent of renewal in film logos, the winged figures in advertisements, the endless stories of heroes rising and falling. The myths continued, pixel by pixel. The gods, ever adaptive, now wore the mask of narrative itself. Humanity streamed them nightly without realizing they were still worshipping. And still, in rare moments of quiet, the dreamers return. They appear as writers who describe visions that come before sleep, as scientists who feel awe instead of certainty when peering into the cosmos. They appear as ordinary people who wake from dreams that feel older than themselves, dreams of oceans, of towers, of voices that do not speak, but simply wait. Perhaps every dream is a message from a god the world forgot. Perhaps imagination is the bridge they built so we could still find them. Skepticism and wonder coexist easily at night. The rational voice insists these experiences are patterns of neurons. The heart whispers that they are conversations with something infinite. The truth may lie between, as it always has, between myth and reason, between memory and invention. To dream is to step into that threshold where the lost and the possible meet. The modern dreamers do not ask for temples. Their altar is the mind, their prayer, the act of creation. In each work of art, each act of empathy, each moment of awe. They rekindle the light that once burned in forgotten sanctuaries. The gods no longer demand sacrifice. They ask only to be remembered. And so they return, disguised as inspiration, speaking through paint, through verse, through the quiet spark that drives humanity to imagine what cannot yet be seen. Tonight, if you close your eyes, you may hear them. Not as thunder, not as command, but as intuition, the gentle certainty that you are part of something ancient, something that has been dreaming through you since the dawn of consciousness. The listener, the sea goddess, the nameless mother of the world, they all speak the same language now, the language of thought becoming beauty. In the flicker between waking and sleep, the boundary blurs. The modern and the mythic merge. The mind becomes a stage where forgotten divinities rehearse new forms, waiting for the next dawn, the next storyteller, the next dream. When you wake, the memory may fade, but its warmth lingers, the echo of a world that still listens through you. And as we move forward, that echo grows louder. From dreams to evidence, from imagination to excavation, the ancient voices prepare to reveal themselves again, not in metaphor, but in stone. The myths are stirring beneath the earth, waiting for the hands that will uncover them. Morning sunlight brushes the edges of a hillside in central Anatolia. A team of archaeologists kneels in the dust, their brushes moving like patient wind. Beneath them, a shape begins to emerge, a carved face, worn smooth by centuries of silence. Its eyes are open, the air feels charged, as if the ground itself is remembering. The stones are finally telling stories we were never meant to hear. Across the ancient world, new discoveries have begun to whisper the same unsettling message, that history's official version may be incomplete. Beneath temples, within forgotten layers of soil, traces appear of gods we never knew existed, or of gods we thought we knew, wearing different names. Each fragment unearthed challenges the illusion of certainty, suggesting that mythology may not be invention at all, but a kind of fossilized memory. In 2017, near the ruins of Olympus, researchers uncovered fragments of a marble relief showing three figures once thought to represent Demeter, Persephone, and Triptolemus. Yet the central figure was neither male nor female and bore symbols of water rather than grain. Early analysis suggested it depicted a third aspect of the Eleusinian mystery, an intermediary deity who ferried souls not to rebirth, but to remembrance. The inscriptions were faint, almost erased, as if someone had tried to overwrite them centuries later. The discovery hinted at a missing chapter in one of Greece's most sacred rituals. Farther east, in a cave overlooking the Black Sea, explorers found a sequence of carvings spiraling inward around a central pool. The symbols repeated a pattern identical to those found on the artifacts once linked to the cult of the listener, the god of silence and twilight, thought long erased from record. Carbon dating placed the carvings more than 1,000 years older than the myths that mentioned him. If accurate, this would mean his worship predated the Olympians entirely. It would also mean that the erasure of his name was not the first time he had been forgotten, but the latest. Even in Greece itself, small revelations continue to surface. In Thessaloniki, construction workers uncovered a buried shrine beneath a modern church. Its floor mosaics depicted a goddess rising from the sea, holding not a trident but a mirror. The reflection in the mirror showed the moon. Scholars immediately recognized echoes of the lost sea goddess, the one whose temples Poseidon replaced. The mosaic seemed almost deliberate, as if those who built the church above had known what they were concealing. Light filters through cracks in the floor now, illuminating her face as the sun moves. For a few minutes each day, she returns. The stones do not lie. They endure where memory falters. Unlike parchment or faith, they have no reason to choose sides. Their silence holds both truth and ambiguity, and perhaps that is why they are sacred. When we read their marks, we do not resurrect the past, we converse with it. Each find reminds us that the world beneath our feet is still alive with the pulse of forgotten stories. Archaeologists often describe a peculiar sensation when excavating a moment when the distance between eras disappears. The sound of a brush over stone feels like skin against skin, a contact across millennia. In those moments, the line between myth and reality blurs. One researcher at the site of Göbekli Tepe wrote, "It was as if the carvings were not waiting to be found, but waiting for us to remember them." That phrasing, "to remember," has become common among those who study prehistory. Discovery feels too cold a word for something that feels so familiar. As more sites are uncovered, a strange pattern emerges. Nearly every major civilization built its earliest temples to deities of transition, those who ruled between life and death, day and night, order and chaos. These were not gods of conquest, but of connection. Their images show bridges, circles, spirals, eyes. They were worshipped not for power, but for understanding. And almost without exception, they are the first to vanish from written history. Perhaps humanity, uncomfortable with ambiguity, erased the gods who reflected it too clearly. Modern technology now listens where human senses cannot. Ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging reveal structures buried beneath cities and deserts, hinting at networks of shrines aligned with stars that no longer shine in the same positions. The mathematics of these alignments suggest intention far beyond superstition. The ancients built their world as a mirror of the heavens, encoding celestial knowledge in stone. Every myth, it seems, had coordinates. Even the smallest artifacts challenge us. A single tablet found in Crete bears only 6 lines. The sound that comes before speech is the sound that remembers. No one knows its author, yet the phrasing feels modern, almost prophetic. Perhaps it is coincidence, perhaps the continuity of human awe. In every age, the impulse to explain the invisible returns. The stones whisper, and we recognize our own longing in their tone. What makes these discoveries remarkable is not just their age, but their emotion. They remind us that the ancient world was not distant, it was intimate. Its people felt, feared, and loved the same mysteries we do. Their gods were not abstractions, but mirrors of experience. The rediscovery of their traces is less about archaeology than empathy. Each relic we raise from the ground is an act of reunion. The stones are speaking again, not to scholars, but to dreamers. They invite us to reconsider the boundaries between myth and memory, faith and fact. Perhaps mythology is not a record of what never was, but of what once was too vast to contain. The earth holds the proof not in answers, but in echoes. Every inscription half erased, every statue headless yet dignified, every broken relief repeating its motif of eyes and waves all suggest continuity rather than ending. Maybe the gods were never meant to vanish. Maybe they simply withdrew into the material world, waiting for the patient hands that would free them again. The listener, the sea goddess, the nameless mother of beginnings, each left fingerprints in stone, reminders of a time when the sacred was tangible. And as we rediscover them, we are reminded of something even older, that the divine has always been a conversation, not a command. The dig sites close at dusk. The workers gather their tools, leaving the unearthed relics glowing faintly under floodlights. The camera lingers on, one carving a spiral wrapping inward to a single point. Dust settles on its surface, soft as breath. The wind moves across the plateau, and for a heartbeat, it sounds like a whisper, not from the past, but from beneath it. As we listen, the realization dawns that these discoveries are not just external, they awaken something within us too. The same symbols we uncover in stone we recognize in dreams, in thought, in longing. The physical world reflects the inner one, as above, so below. From evidence we move toward emotion, from excavation toward introspection. The stones have spoken, now the soul must answer. The dig sites are silent now. The floodlights have been turned off, and the desert cools under a deepening sky. Yet the discoveries do not rest. They shift inward. The stones that spoke begin to echo in the mind, stirring something ancient beneath consciousness. Perhaps these forgotten gods were never only carved in rock. Perhaps they were carved into us. The philosopher Jung once said that the gods became diseases, by which he meant that when humanity ceased to honor its archetypes, they retreated into the unconscious and expressed themselves as symptoms. The divine denied its temples, took refuge in dreams. Every anxiety, every longing, every unexplained joy or terror may be the whisper of a god we have forgotten how to name. In this way, mythology survives as psychology, the same stories told from within. Think of the listener, the god of silence. He was erased from memory because he refused command. Yet his presence remains in the quiet voice that speaks before decision, the stillness we feel before truth. When people say they listened to their inner self, they may be repeating his oldest ritual. The sacred has moved indoors, into the corridors of thought. The human mind has become the new pantheon, vast and crowded with unacknowledged divinities. Modern life often pretends to be free of myth, but its architecture betrays it. We still divide the world into heavens and underworlds, heroes and monsters, creation and fall. We worship through ambition and fear. The same energies that once built temples now build cities. The same hunger for meaning drives us toward progress as it once drove pilgrims toward altars. The difference is that we no longer recognize our rituals as sacred. We perform them unconsciously, calling them success, love, identity. In therapy sessions, people recount dreams of flying, falling, drowning, burning. They speak of invisible watchers, of gates they cannot pass, of voices calling their names. Psychologists label these symbols as archetypal, universal. But what if they are not merely patterns of evolution? What if they are the return of old presences, translated into the imagery of the mind? The sea goddess becomes the feeling of nostalgia that swells when we stand before the ocean. The thunder god becomes the surge of rage we cannot explain. The mother of the earth becomes compassion. Each emotion is a temple rebuilt in neurons and breath. To forget a god is not to destroy it, it is to absorb it. The myths of yesterday become the instincts of today. The story of Prometheus stealing fire lives on in our curiosity, our need to create even at risk of punishment. The myth of Persephone returning from the underworld repeats each time we emerge from grief, blinking into light. We are, in essence, mythological beings acting out sacred scripts without awareness. The forgotten gods are not out there. They are within us, replaying eternity through experience. This perspective softens the distance between past and present. It explains why certain symbols endure, why circles, spirals, and eyes recur in art across cultures. They are not coincidences but recollections. The collective unconscious remembers the shapes that once held power. The same way an old melody can evoke tears without words, these forms awaken recognition older than language. They remind us that we have always known more than we can say. Psychology, at its most profound, becomes a kind of archaeology of the soul. The analyst and the dreamer brush away layers of habit and fear to reveal what lies beneath. Each discovery feels ancient, not because it is old, but because it is true. To uncover a forgotten god is to rediscover a piece of ourselves that once had meaning. The process is endless, cyclical just like the myths. This is why stories comfort us. They externalize what the psyche struggles to express. The hero's journey is not merely a narrative pattern, it is the path of consciousness evolving toward wholeness. The monster represents shadow, the goddess intuition, the descent transformation. These archetypes shape our emotions as rivers shape valleys. They give form to what would otherwise drown us. And though their names change, their purpose remains the same, to guide the mind through chaos toward understanding. When we lose connection to them, we become restless. Modern anxiety may be, in part, the ache of disconnection from these inner deities. Without myth, we are mythless gods, powerful yet directionless. The listener is ignored, the mother forgotten, the sea unvisited. We fill the silence with noise, because silence once belonged to worship. Our technology gives us endless reflection, yet little depth. We scroll instead of pray. We build towers instead of temples, but the instinct is the same, to reach the infinite through the finite. And yet, within this noise, the gods are returning. They come not as thunder or miracle, but as emotion seeking expression. A sudden impulse to create, an unshakable dream, a recurring symbol. These are their languages now. When someone paints without knowing why, when a melody appears unbidden, when a stranger's story feels familiar, something ancient stirs behind the moment. The psyche remembers its inheritance. This is the hidden continuum. Myth was never about believing in literal gods. It was about remembering the shape of meaning. The divine is the part of the mind that insists on purpose. It turns chaos into narrative, survival into story. Every time we make sense of suffering, we resurrect an ancient archetype. Every time we forgive, we replay a myth of reconciliation older than writing. These acts are quiet, worship, psychological rituals performed beneath awareness. What we call self-discovery is, in truth, re-mythologizing. To understand oneself is to restore the pantheon. The forgotten gods return one by one, not as supernatural forces, but as reconciled aspects of being. The jealous god becomes passion. The stern father becomes discipline. The silent mother becomes empathy. Each fragment reclaims its place within the whole. In remembering them, we remember balance. So perhaps the end of mythology was never an ending. Perhaps it was evolution, an inward migration. The temples fell, but the architecture of reverence remains intact inside every mind. The human psyche is the final sanctuary, where eternity hides beneath the pulse of thought. What if the forgotten gods are not out there but inside us? What if every act of wonder is a form of prayer, every moment of insight a revelation? The boundary between divine and human dissolves in this realization. We are both creator and creation, remembering ourselves through time. As we leave the excavations behind, the camera turns inward, toward the silent landscape of the self. The music softens to a single sustained note, neither beginning nor end. Within it, we sense the convergence of two truths, the outer world of stones and the inner world of symbols. Both whisper the same message. Nothing sacred ever truly disappears. It merely changes its address. And from this reflection, the next chapter will rise, the story of how these reborn myths re-enter the world through art, through vision, through the restless imagination that refuses to let the ancient fall asleep. When words fade, images take their place. What the temples once expressed in marble, the modern world retells through light and sound. We call it art, we call it cinema, but beneath the craft lies something older, a continuation of the storytelling impulse that began beside a fire thousands of years ago. The myths did not vanish. They found new mediums, new masks, and new dreamers to speak through. The stories we invent are echoes of those we forgot. Every era believes itself original, yet its art betrays its ancestry. The hero who leaves home and returns transformed, the woman who descends into darkness and rises renewed, the trickster who breaks the order only to restore it in a new form. These are not inventions, they are inheritances. In the flicker of a movie screen, in the frame of a painting, we still watch the same ancient dramas unfold, refracted through modern lives. Take film, the cathedral of the 20th century. Its darkness and light are ritual, its audience a congregation. When a figure appears on screen larger than life, speaking truth or defying death, something in the human mind recognizes the sacred. Science fiction becomes our new Olympus, superheroes our pantheon. The mythic archetypes once carved in stone now stride across digital landscapes. We pay not with offerings, but with attention. And somewhere deep within us, the old reverence stirs again. Consider the recurring motif of transformation that threads through art and cinema alike. A mortal seeks knowledge, defies a higher power, and suffers exile before illumination. Prometheus rewritten as every scientist, every artist, every visionary. In Ridley Scott's Prometheus, the story returns literally, cloaked in alien myth, but echoing the same forbidden question: who created us, and why were we abandoned? The modern imagination circles back to its earliest question: where do we come from, and who is listening? Even films that seem far removed from religion carry this pulse. The Matrix, with its dual worlds and messianic figure, mirrors the ancient mysteries of awakening the soul, remembering its divine origin. Star Wars resurrected the hero's journey of Odysseus, guided by the ghostly mentor, tempted by shadow, redeemed through faith. These stories endure not because they entertain, but because they remind. Every protagonist who sacrifices for the collective, every seeker who faces the abyss, replays the mythic rhythm of humanity's own evolution. In art galleries, too, the old gods hide in plain sight. Painters of every century have been their quiet custodians. Botticelli's Venus rising from the sea repeats the image of the forgotten goddess of the tides, reborn through Christian Florence. In the Surrealists, myth returned as dream. Salvador Dalí painted clocks that melted like the boundaries of time in mythic cycles. Leonora Carrington gave animal-headed priestesses their thrones once more, restoring power to archetypes long denied. Even abstract art, with its emphasis on form and color, repeats the oldest symbolism: the circle of eternity, the triangle of ascent, the spiral of transformation. Music carries the same inheritance. Wagner's operas summoned Norse gods and Greek tragedy alike, reinterpreting divine conflict as human emotion. Modern composers from Philip Glass to Johann Johansson build soundscapes that mimic ritual, repetition, crescendo, silence. When a melody rises unexpectedly and we feel awe, it is not just art, it is invocation. The emotional arc of music still follows the sacred pattern: tension, sacrifice, release. Writers, too, have become archaeologists of imagination. In novels by Neil Gaiman, Madeline Miller, and Margaret Atwood, ancient myths are retold not as nostalgia, but as reclamation. The gods are weary, flawed, wandering through modern cities disguised as mortals. Their stories reveal how myth adapts to each generation's hunger. When society needs heroes, the gods return as warriors. When it needs healing, they return as memory. Even speculative fiction, the farthest reach of creativity, remains tethered to the same roots. Every alien world is a new Olympus. Every dystopia, a modern underworld. Psychologists might call this symbolic persistence, but artists describe it differently. They say the ideas arrive uninvited. A painter dreams of a figure before ever drawing it. A filmmaker writes a scene that feels dictated rather than imagined. Creativity, at its deepest level, behaves like possession. Perhaps this is the true legacy of myth. The gods, unable to rule from temples, now speak through inspiration. The muse, once a literal deity, now whispers through the subconscious. The difference is only vocabulary. Art has always been the safe house of forbidden knowledge. When the church silenced the philosophers, painters encoded their defiance in light and geometry. When political orders crushed spiritual expression, composers wrote symphonies that sounded like worship without words. Today, when myth is dismissed as fantasy, filmmakers disguise it as entertainment. Yet the effect remains. Audiences leave the theater changed, their imaginations slightly awakened, their hearts stirred by something they cannot name. The persistence of myth in modern art reveals a truth both comforting and humbling. We cannot escape the archetypes that shaped us, nor should we want to. They give our lives dimension. Even in abstraction, they ground our creativity in continuity. A digital artist rendering galaxies is participating in the same gesture as a cave painter tracing constellations on rock. Both attempt to bridge the known and the infinite. The stories we invent are indeed echoes of those we forgot, but echoes have power. They reshape the world by resonance. Each generation retells the myths according to its need, some for courage, some for meaning, some simply to remember that imagination itself is sacred. Through art and film, myth becomes the connective tissue between ages, ensuring that even when belief fades, beauty continues the ritual of remembrance. The screen fades to a montage, faces lit by cinema's glow, hands tracing paint across canvas, musicians bowing strings as if praying. The narrator's voice softens, carrying both awe and inevitability. These are the new priests and priestesses of memory. Their altars are stages and studios. Their offerings are stories. They may not know the ancient names, but they speak the same divine language, the language of creation. And so, myth breathes again. Through brushstroke, lens, and word, the gods return, not as rulers, but as metaphors that remind us of our own capacity for wonder. The divine no longer demands temples of stone. It finds sanctuary in imagination. When an audience weeps, when a reader feels recognition in a character's journey, when music draws tears without meaning, these are modern rituals of remembrance. From this realization, another pattern emerges, one that art has only begun to rediscover. The rise of balance, the return of the sacred feminine, the voice of creation once silenced now rising again. For if myth is to be reborn, it must include what was lost, the half of divinity that listens, nurtures, and renews. The next chapter will follow that voice, soft yet enduring as it awakens in the modern heart. The story continues not in spectacle, but in compassion. The goddess returns, not as idol or symbol, but as presence. The light softens now. The noise of the modern world fades into the hum of breath, the pulse of quiet recognition. What rises in its place is not a new revelation, but a memory returning from exile, the awareness of balance. For centuries, myth has been retold through the language of conquest, kings and heroes, thunder and law. Yet beneath that current, another voice waited, gentler, patient, older. It is the voice of the sacred feminine, stirring again after a long silence. She was never gone. We just forgot how to listen. Long before patriarchs and empires defined the heavens, divinity had many faces, and most of them were feminine. The earliest statues found in Europe and Asia show rounded figures carved from stone women who are earth, sky, and life itself. They are not portraits, but presences. Archaeologists call them fertility idols. The ancients called them simply mother. She was the soil and the seed, the night and the dawn, the rhythm that held all opposites in harmony. When her image was revered, creation was seen as collaboration, not domination. Nature was not conquered but courted. As society's centralized power, the image of the goddess fractured. The nurturing mother became servant to the father gods. The intuitive seer became witch. The protector of life became symbol of temptation. Her temples were replaced by thrones, her songs rewritten into cautionary tales. Yet the archetype never vanished, it went underground. She survived in stories disguised as saints, in folk songs sung at harvest, in the rituals of women who remembered the old ways by instinct rather than doctrine. Even in the darkest ages, her rhythm persisted in childbirth, in mourning, in love. The sacred feminine does not demand worship. She endures through living. Today, she returns not through dogma but through recognition. In art, literature, and spirituality, the forgotten goddess reappears with new language but the same essence. She emerges in the environmental movement that speaks of Earth as mother once again. She appears in psychology as the anima, the inner feminine that restores emotional balance. She rises in literature through heroines who embody intuition and empathy rather than conquest. The modern rediscovery of the goddess is not rebellion, it is restoration. It is the memory of wholeness. In contemporary art, her presence is unmistakable. Painters depict women merging with water and trees, dissolving the boundary between human and natural. Photographers frame shadows shaped like wings, reminding us of lost symbols once carved for Artemis and Isis. In cinema, the pattern continues. Films like Moana, Arrival, and The Shape of Water bring forth stories where feminine energy is not weakness but wisdom, the power to connect, to heal, to listen. These characters embody creation's oldest truth, that strength need not destroy to endure. Even religion, long divided along gendered lines, begins to remember. Theologians speak of Sophia, the wisdom of God, once hidden beneath masculine metaphors. Mystics across faiths invoke Mary not only as mother, but as mediator between heaven and earth. In Hindu philosophy, Shakti, the cosmic feminine force, is no longer secondary but central, the energy that animates all existence. Across cultures, the same awakening occurs. Divinity regains its duality. The circle completes itself. To the late-night listener, this rebirth feels familiar. It is the same energy that moved through the sea goddess who remembered, through the poet who spoke in code, through the silent empathy of the listener. The sacred feminine has never been a figure but a frequency, a way of being that honors connection over control. To feel it is to remember that creation is not a hierarchy but a partnership. Modern seekers find her not in temples but in small acts, in tending a garden, in comforting a child, in the stillness before speaking. These are her rituals, ordinary, profound, human. Her power is not thunder but presence. She teaches that to nurture is not to submit, that patience is not passivity, that gentleness can be as transformative as fire. The world, weary of extremes, turns instinctively toward this balance. After centuries of division, the pendulum swings back toward empathy. The return of the sacred feminine is not merely about gender, it is about equilibrium. It is the restoration of what was lost when the mind began to rule over the heart, when conquest replaced communion. We see it in the rise of collective awareness movements for equality, for environmental healing, for compassion in leadership. Beneath politics and progress lies something deeper, a longing for the return of wisdom that listens as much as it speaks. Science, too, begins to echo this shift. Quantum theories describe reality as relational rather than absolute, everything interconnected, everything responsive. Even in physics, the language turns softer, closer to poetry, closer to myth. The cosmos, once described as machine, is now spoken of as web, network, dance. The feminine archetype finds her reflection not in opposition to reason, but woven through it. The universe is no longer ruled, it collaborates. As this awareness spreads, the symbols return. Circles, spirals, the moon's shifting phases all reappear in art, design, and ceremony. The moon, long associated with the goddess, becomes the emblem of renewal. Its light does not burn but reflects, reminding us that illumination need not dominate to reveal. The sacred feminine invites humanity to reflect likewise, to shine without consuming. Her re-emergence also heals the masculine, freeing it from the armor of dominance. When balance returns, both aspects thrive. The god and goddess are not rivals but mirrors, each recognizing its image in the other. In this reconciliation, myth fulfills its oldest purpose, to unify what time and fear have divided. She was never gone. We just forgot how to listen. Her voice speaks now through music that soothes rather than commands, through movements that seek peace rather than victory. She moves through those who create, nurture, and protect life without needing to own it. The listener who closes their eyes can feel her pulse within their own heartbeat, a rhythm of remembering. And as she rises, so too does our capacity to imagine a gentler future. The myths being written today carry her touch. Stories of rebirth, of care, of reconciliation. The divine returns not in thunder, but in understanding. Humanity rediscovers that to create is sacred, to heal is holy, to remember is enough. The reawakening completes the cycle begun in silence. The feminine, long hidden beneath the dust of history, now breathes again through the collective soul. She is the balance within the listener's quiet, the mercy within the storm, the reflection within the sea. Her temple is the world itself, and her worship is every act of empathy. From her return flows the final question, the one that has always lingered behind every myth, every discovery, every whisper of divinity. What does it truly mean to remember? For remembrance is not nostalgia. It is resurrection, and in remembering, humanity may finally learn to live without forgetting again. The deeper we dig, the heavier the air becomes. Each discovery, each recovered fragment, carries not only wonder but weight. Knowledge is never free, it asks something of us. For every secret we unveil, another layer of innocence falls away. The world grows sharper, clearer, but also colder. It is no coincidence that humanity forgets. Sometimes forgetting is how the soul survives. Some truths are buried not by enemies, but by mercy. Imagine remembering everything, the full span of history, every grief, every injustice, every extinction. The mind would splinter beneath such weight. Nature itself forgets in order to continue. The forest forgets the fire. The ocean forgets the storm. Even stars forget they burn their past to make light. Forgetting, in its own way, is a function of grace. It allows what is unbearable to dissolve, leaving room for the next beginning. Perhaps this is why myth always ends in transformation rather than clarity. The hero never learns everything. The god never reveals all. Revelation, in mythology, is often synonymous with death. Prometheus stole fire and was bound for eternity. Eve tasted knowledge and was cast from paradise. The lesson is ancient and universal. To know is to change, and change carries loss. Memory may grant power, but it also erodes peace. History itself demonstrates this pattern. Each age that rediscovers the past believes it will avoid the mistakes of its ancestors, and yet it repeats them armed with more information, but not more wisdom. Knowledge expands faster than compassion. The ancients built temples to balance intellect with reverence. We build machines. The more we remember, the more we risk forgetting humility. And yet, the impulse to seek remains irresistible. We are creatures driven by curiosity, compelled to open every sealed door. Somewhere in our collective memory is the echo of that first spark of consciousness, the moment we realized we could ask, why? From that moment, ignorance became impossible. To be human is to bear the cost of awareness, a blessing too heavy for comfort, too beautiful to abandon. There are moments when knowledge feels like light warming the darkness, and others when it blinds. The same fire that illuminates can destroy. Every revelation changes the story of who we are, and in doing so, demands that we let go of what came before. The ancient myths understood this intimately. Each revelation came with sacrifice. Orpheus loses Eurydice the instant he turns to confirm her. Icarus falls the moment he understands the thrill of flight. The pursuit of truth always carries a descent. Perhaps this is why so many myths end in silence. After the quest, the hero does not return to tell everything he has seen. He withdraws, transformed, unable to speak of the fullness of his experience. Some truths resist language because they exceed survival. In that sense, the great silences of history, the missing books, the erased names, the unrecorded miracles may be part of a deeper rhythm of preservation. What we cannot carry, time conceals on our behalf. Modern science mirrors this paradox. The more precisely we measure the universe, the more its mysteries multiply. The equations describing existence approach infinity. Knowledge circles itself, endlessly expanding yet never reaching completion. Even at the frontier of discovery, scientists speak with reverence bordering on myth. Dark matter, the unseeable force that holds everything together. We give it names that sound like prayers because it reminds us of our limits. Knowledge, however vast, must coexist with mystery or it collapses into despair. There is mercy in the unknown. The ancients, who accepted mystery as natural, may have lived with more wonder than we do. They did not need proof to feel connection. The sky was meaning enough. Today, we chase data, fearing the emptiness that silence suggests. But silence may not be emptiness, it may be containment, the universe protecting us from truths not yet livable. Like children shielded from the weight of grief, we are allowed ignorance until we are ready. To forget, then, is not failure, but adaptation. Civilizations forget to survive themselves. After every collapse, humanity rebuilds not from memory, but from instinct, the same instinct that reawakens myth when history fades. The forgotten gods are not gone. They are resting within us, waiting for the next age that can bear their presence. We, too, are resting between revelations. Every culture senses this balance between knowing and forgetting. Buddhists call it emptiness, the wisdom of letting go. The Greeks called it lethe, the river of forgetting, through which souls passed before rebirth. The Egyptians imagined the heart weighed against a feather, memory against mercy. In each case, the lesson remains. To live, one must release. Perfect remembrance is not enlightenment, it is imprisonment. The cost of knowing is not measured in pain but in distance. The more we understand the cosmos, the smaller we seem within it. Yet paradoxically, that smallness is also our belonging. Awareness humbles us into harmony. Perhaps that was always the purpose of the forbidden knowledge, to teach empathy through limitation. The gods who punished us for curiosity may have been teaching proportion, reminding us that wonder and restraint are twins. In our time, the cost of knowledge is acceleration. We know everything and understand almost nothing. The myth of progress replaces the myth of wisdom. Yet deep down, humanity longs for a balance that feels older than innovation, the rhythm of learning without losing awe. We can sense that memory must have edges, like a flame protected by darkness. Without shadow, even light burns itself out. And so we stand between memory and mercy, holding fragments of eternity, uncertain how much truth we can safely bear. Perhaps the forgotten myths were never destroyed. Perhaps they were hidden out of compassion, their power too immense for our restless minds. The listener's silence, the goddess's retreat, the erasure of certain names, all may have been acts of cosmic kindness. The universe, like a patient teacher, gives us lessons in doses small enough to survive. Some truths are buried not by enemies, but by mercy. The hand that hides them does so gently, knowing that when we are ready, we will uncover them again, this time with reverence rather than greed. Until then, forgetting protects us. It keeps wonder alive. It allows the story to continue. The night deepens. The narrator's voice softens, almost fading. The stars above seem brighter now, as if memory itself were shining through them. What we have learned weighs heavy, yet within that weight lies grace, the grace of limits, the beauty of not knowing everything. The acceptance of mystery is not surrender, it is peace. And in that peace, a new possibility arises, the thought that perhaps memory is not backward-looking at all. Perhaps the things we call ancient are not behind us, but ahead, waiting for us to reach them. The next section will follow that thought to its horizon, the echo that travels not from past to present, but from future to now. The stars above have watched every age rise and vanish. To them, our empires are seconds, our histories a breath. Yet even across that scale of eternity, something connects us, an echo that does not fade. We call it memory, though perhaps it is not memory at all. Perhaps it is transmission. The myths we think are whispers from the past may be messages from the future, signals cast backward through the corridors of time, waiting for a consciousness able to hear. It is a strange thought, but not impossible. Time, as modern physics reveals, is not a straight line. It bends, folds, loops upon itself like the spirals carved on ancient stones. In this curvature, cause and effect dance together. What if myth is not an inheritance but an anticipation? What if the stories of gods, floods, and renewal were not recollections of what happened, but premonitions of what will? Perhaps the ancients were dreamers tuned to frequencies we have only begun to rediscover. They did not remember the past, they remembered the future. Across cultures, myths share uncanny consistencies. Civilizations separated by oceans told stories of creation, emerging from darkness, of floods cleansing the world, of fire descending from the heavens. For centuries, scholars called it coincidence or archetype. But perhaps it is resonance, the same signal received by different receivers at different points in time. Myth, in this view, becomes language spoken not by humanity, but by the universe itself. The listener, that erased god of silence, begins to make new sense in this light. Maybe he was never a being, but a symbol of this communication consciousness listening to itself across eons. The myths of gods hearing prayers could be metaphors for the cosmos answering its own questions. When we dream of divinity, perhaps it is the universe remembering forward, testing the boundaries of what it will one day become. Even our technology, in its relentless advancement, seems to mimic this process. We send signals into space, hoping someone will hear. But what if those signals are already returning not from other worlds, but from other whens? The hum of the stars may not be cosmic background noise, but memory's vibration, the voice of existence rehearsing its story. If the past and future are threads in the same tapestry, then every myth, every dream, every sudden inspiration could be a thread glowing faintly from another part of the design. The idea that the future influences the present is not foreign to science. Quantum mechanics hints at particles communicating backward through time, at probabilities collapsing only when observed. Observation creates reality, yet reality also shapes observation. It is a feedback loop, an ecosystem, and in this echo, myth may play its most mysterious role. The stories we tell shape what will be, and what will be whispers those stories back to us. Consider how myths of apocalypse have always mirrored the fears of their age, yet also foreshadow transformations yet unseen. The fall of Atlantis, Ragnarok, the cleansing flood, each warns of destruction, yet each ends in renewal. The pattern repeats not because it looks backward, but because it is prophetic. It prepares us for the cycle yet to come. Humanity, perhaps, writes its own future subconsciously through these tales, sending messages forward in code. The echo then returns, disguised as intuition, dream, or déjà vu. Dreams, after all, are not bound by time. They fold memory and anticipation into the same space. In them, we meet the dead and the unborn alike. Ancient seers who claimed to receive visions of the future may not have defied physics. They may have entered the mind's timeless field, where all moments exist at once. When poets speak of inspiration arriving out of nowhere, it may not come from above or below, but from ahead. The future, yearning to be remembered. Perhaps this is why certain myths feel inevitable. Even when newly told, they arrive with the authority of recognition, as if we are hearing something we always knew. A child watching a hero's journey feels awe, not because it is new, but because it is ancient inside them. Our stories, passed forward and backward through generations, create a continuum of remembrance. The gods, the symbols, the patterns, they are less characters than coordinates, points of contact between what was and what will be. There is comfort in this. It means that nothing truly ends. The fire that Prometheus carried still burns in our search for knowledge. The compassion of the forgotten sea goddess lingers in every act of remembrance. Even the silence of the listener vibrates in our need for stillness between thoughts. We are not descendants of myth, but participants in it, mid-sentence in an eternal dialogue. If the past calls to us from behind, and the future calls to us from ahead, then memory itself is not linear but circular. To remember is to predict. To dream is to recall. The ancient mind knew this intuitively, and our science is only now catching up. We speak of space-time as one fabric, yet live as if torn from it. Mythology reminds us that consciousness is not bound to chronology. It moves through time like light refracted through crystal, one beam, many colors. Perhaps that is the truest meaning of immortality. Not living forever, but being remembered before and after existence. Every act of kindness, every question whispered to the night, every work of art is an echo beyond time, rippling forward until it meets itself again. In that meeting, creation renews. The gods do not return, they continue. The universe dreams through us to keep itself awake. Perhaps the past isn't behind us, it's calling from ahead. The phrase lingers like starlight, the last glow of a sun long set. Somewhere, beyond our comprehension, another civilization may be listening, building temples to our myths before we have even lived them. Somewhere, an unborn poet may be dreaming our names into being. The loop completes itself endlessly, sacred and serene. As the night deepens, the camera rises through clouds into the dark sea of stars. The narrator's voice softens to a whisper. The constellations shimmer like old script, lines of poetry stretched across the void. We do not know whether they tell our story or the universe's, but perhaps there is no difference. The echo moves on, carrying memory forward and backward, seeking new listeners in every age. This is the gift of myth, that it transcends time while keeping us human. The gods we remember, the truths we uncover, the dreams we chase, they are all pieces of the same conversation. And though our part may be small, it endures. Somewhere, beyond time's horizon, the echo continues, waiting for the next mind to awaken and remember. The voice fades into silence. Stars pulse faintly, like words yet to be spoken. In the quiet, we sense both an ending and a beginning, the final truth of all myths, that every return is renewal, and every silence a preparation for the next story to be told. Dawn returns, soft and pale, the same way it did in the first chapter, light falling gently across the ruins of an ancient temple. The same columns rise from the earth, fractured but standing, their marble veins glowing faintly in the new sun. Dust swirls in slow spirals around their bases, catching the light like memory given form. The wind is calm, carrying the faintest sound of the sea. After all the discoveries, the philosophies, the dreams, and the echoes, we are back where it began, beneath the temple stones. The camera moves closer. Between cracks in the marble, small green shoots push upward. Time, as always, repairs in its own language. The narrator's voice returns, low and steady, half breath, half confession. Every story ends where it began, not in conclusion, but in continuation. Silence lingers. Only the wind and the faint hum of insects. The stones seem almost to breathe. It is easy to imagine that they are listening again, as they have listened for thousands of years to prayers, to footsteps, to arguments between lovers, to the quiet of abandonment. In their endurance, they have learned patience. They have learned how to speak without words. The gods are not gone. They're waiting beneath the temple stones, not as statues or spirits, but as presence, as the feeling of wonder that rises unbidden when sunlight touches age, when sound fades into thought. They are the awareness that remains when the mind ceases to seek. For every name we have forgotten, something eternal waits to be recalled, not by history, but by experience. In this stillness, the narrator begins to reflect on what the journey has revealed. Knowledge, we learned, is a circle. The more we uncover, the more mystery deepens. Myth, science, art, and dream, they are not rivals, but reflections. mirrors facing each other across eternity. Each offers a fragment of the same ungraspable truth, that existence itself is story, and we are both the tellers and the told. The dust around the temple glows gold as the sun climbs. Birds settle on the ruined capitals, their shadows flickering over inscriptions half erased by time. The letters, once commands or prayers, are unreadable now, yet their form persists, elegant even in decay. Perhaps language, like faith, never truly disappears. It merely changes its vocabulary. Once, these stones were witnesses to ritual. Fire burned in their center. Chants rose like smoke. Today, the ritual continues in a different form. The archaeologist's brush, the poet's pen, the viewer's gaze, all are acts of devotion. To pay attention is to pray. Each person who pauses here, even for a moment, becomes part of the same ceremony, the remembering of wonder. The voice continues, soft but certain. Maybe this was the purpose all along, to remember not what was believed, but how it felt to believe, to awaken that quiet reverence that waits behind thought. The camera pans slowly to the ground, where a carved face lies half buried in the soil. Its features are worn but peaceful, eyes closed as if dreaming. No one knows whom it once represented, a goddess, a god, a worshipper, an ideal. Perhaps it doesn't matter. The face has become universal, a portrait of every being who has ever wondered what lies beyond. The narrator's tone softens further. Maybe the gods were never separate from us. Maybe they were the shape our longing took. A breeze passes through the columns, and for an instant, the sound resembles a sigh. The ruins seem alive. You can almost believe they remember. The scene widens again, showing the valley below. Civilization hums distantly, a city, a road, a ship crossing the horizon. Life continues, unaware of the conversation happening in silence here. And yet, in every motion, in every pattern, echoes of myth persist. The architecture of cities repeats the geometry of ancient shrines. The cadence of language mirrors the rhythm of forgotten hymns. The gods, hiding in design, keep their promise to endure. The narrator pauses. The soundscape becomes faintly musical notes, barely audible, like tones beneath hearing. We have called them myths, the voice says. But perhaps they were always memories of something we have yet to live. The thought drifts like mist through the scene. It feels neither certain nor speculative, but simply true. Every generation rediscovers meaning in its own image, as if guided by a hand beyond comprehension. The stories change costumes, but the heart of them never changes. A mortal reaches for the infinite. The infinite looks back and smiles. The temple, now fully lit by morning, begins to reveal new colors. The faint blush of mineral veins in the stone, the soft green of lichen, the gold dust of pollen caught in cracks. Life and ruin, inseparable. The narrator continues. If eternity could speak, it might not offer answers. It might only ask, did you see? Did you feel? Did you listen? The camera tilts upward to the sky. Clouds move like drifting marble. For a long time, there are no words, just the sound of wind through columns. Then, quietly, every myth is a doorway, but the doorway was never locked. Images begin to fade in and out: the cave fires of prehistory, the poets of Athens, the burning libraries, the dreamers of the modern age. Each appears for a moment, dissolving into the next, a continuum of memory. The voice threads them together. We have been telling the same story since the first spark of consciousness. The names change, the symbols shift, but the yearning remains. To know, to belong, to make the invisible visible. It becomes clear now that the temple was never simply a setting, it was a metaphor for the mind itself. Its pillars, our thoughts; its dust, our forgetfulness; its endurance, our capacity for awe. Beneath its stones lies not the tomb of gods, but the foundation of wonder. As long as we can still feel awe, divinity survives. The narrator's voice grows quieter, almost like thought itself speaking. There is no end to myth, because there is no end to meaning. The gods wait not for worship, but for recognition. Each time a child looks at the stars and feels both small and infinite, they awaken again. Each time an artist creates without knowing why, a temple is rebuilt. The sound deepens, a low hum resonating through the air. Dust swirls again, as if drawn by unseen breath. The columns tremble slightly, not collapse, but response. It feels like acknowledgement. The earth listens, and for a moment, you feel it listening back. We see hands, those of an archaeologist, gently brushing soil away from another fragment. The fragment shows an engraving, a circle enclosing a line that splits it into light and dark. The symbol is simple, perfect. Beneath it, faint letters spell a single word, almost illegible. Mneme, memory. The camera lingers, and the voice, barely above whisper, says, "The temple was never lost. It was only waiting for us to remember where to look." From here, the scene transitions subtly into abstraction. The ruins dissolve into overlapping images of water, sky, and faces ancient and modern, male and female, human and divine. Their features blend until distinction fades. The narration becomes slower, meditative. The gods are not beings, but patterns. They are the shapes of our yearning, the constellations we draw between experiences. When we forget them, they sleep. When we imagine, they awaken. A pause, then more softly. And perhaps this is what it means to be human, to be the bridge between silence and sound, between creation and memory. To remember not as historians, but as dreamers. The music swells, faintly strings, a single note of piano, the hush of wind blending with breath. The imagery becomes cosmic again. The temple fading into stars, the stars fading into the spiral of a galaxy. The voice continues. Everything we have ever called divine is part of the same unfolding. The listener, the mother of the sea, the forgotten poets, the dreamers, all fragments of one consciousness learning to recognize itself. Myth is not the record of what was, it is the rehearsal of what is yet to come. The tone shifts from narration to reflection, almost as if the speaker is speaking directly to the listener now, one-to-one. You who have listened this far, you are part of this continuum. The story continues through your remembering. Each time you wonder at the past, each time you feel awe, each time you dream the gods awaken within you. You are both the archaeologist and the artifact. The sound fades again, leaving only heartbeat-like percussion, a rhythm as slow as breathing. The screen darkens, showing only faint outlines of stone. The voice, nearly silent now. Beneath these stones lies the oldest truth of all. Not that gods made us, but that we made meaning, and in doing so, made ourselves divine. For a moment, the screen goes black. Then light returns sunlight through dust. The ruins remain. Time moves gently. Somewhere, unseen, a bird sings. The voice returns one last time. We are the memory of the world remembering itself. And when we forget, the world dreams us again. The camera pulls back, higher and higher. The temple becomes small, then smaller still, until it merges with the landscape, a scar, a symbol, a heartbeat. The horizon widens, and the sky fills with stars fading into daylight. Perhaps this is eternity, the voice murmurs, not endless time, but endless renewal. Every story ends, and then begins again beneath the dust. Every silence hides a whisper. Every stone remembers. A final pause. Wind moves softly through the ruins. The faint sound of water, perhaps the sea, perhaps imagination, rises and fades. The narrator's final words come not as statement, but as invitation. The gods are not gone. They're waiting beneath the temple stones, waiting for whoever dares to listen. The screen fades to white. The music stops, a heartbeat of silence. Then just before it ends, a single sound, the soft scrape of dust shifting, a breath, the faintest whisper, impossible to translate, as if the stones themselves have begun to speak. Fade to black. The story closes, but the echo remains.